Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The tapping always begins at 3:17 a.m., not 3:15, not 3:20, precisely 3:17. As if whatever lurks behind my wall maintains a meticulous schedule, 3 gentle knocks in quick succession followed by silence, then 3 more, a pattern that awakens me from even the deepest sleep, leaving me paralyzed beneath my sheets, breath caught in my chest, ears straining in the darkness. I've started to think the sounds aren't coming from the wall at all, but from somewhere much closer, perhaps from inside my own head. When I first moved into Apex Residences, I couldn't believe my luck. After years of living in dilapidated apartments with paper-thin walls and temperamental plumbing, this place seemed like paradise. The lobby gleamed with marble floors and tasteful modern art. The hallways were immaculate, softly lit with recessed lighting that never flickered. My unit on the 11th floor featured floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline perfectly. The realtor had mentioned something about the building's unique acoustic design built to ensure total silence between units. At the time, I'd found that selling point particularly appealing. During the first few days, I settled into a comfortable routine. I arranged my furniture, hung pictures, and began working from my home office. The neighbors seemed pleasant but distant, the kind of people who offer polite nods in the elevator but never initiate conversation. The property manager had given me a curious look when I'd mentioned I'd be taking Unit 1108, but I'd dismissed it as nothing significant. The tapping began on my 4th night. At first, it was so faint I thought I'd imagined it. 3 gentle knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I rolled over and fell back asleep by morning. I'd completely forgotten about it. The next night, the sound returned slightly louder, more insistent. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m., I lay still listening. The taps came from the living room wall adjacent to Unit 1106. I assumed my neighbor had a strange schedule or was having trouble sleeping, annoying but hardly cause for alarm. On the 6th night, when the tapping started, I decided to investigate. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floors. The sound continued as I approached the wall. 3 taps, pause, 3 more. I pressed my ear against the cool surface and the tapping stopped immediately, complete. Silence. I waited for several minutes, but nothing happened. The moment I returned to bed, it started again. This time I ignored it. In the morning, I decided to meet my neighbor. I knocked on the door of 1106, rehearsing a friendly but firm speech about noise complaints. No one answered. I tried again. Later that evening, still nothing. The property manager informed me with a puzzled expression that Unit 1106 had been vacant for months. The previous tenant had moved out unexpectedly, breaking their lease. When I asked why, he merely shrugged and said something vague about personal reasons. That night, I set up my phone to record the wall while I slept. The tapping came right on schedule. 3:17 a.m. I felt my heart rate accelerate as I lay perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic knocks. When I checked the recording the next morning, there was nothing, just hours of silence and the occasional creak of building settling. I tried again the following night with a different recording app, same result. Nothing. By my 2nd week in the apartment, I began developing a heightened awareness of my surroundings. The silence of the building, once comforting, now seemed oppressive. I noticed how sound behaved strangely in my unit. Voices from the hallway would sometimes echo unnaturally, while the noise from the street 11 floors below was inexplicably clear at times. The property manager mentioned something about the building's unique acoustic properties when I asked, but his explanation left me unsatisfied. I began to feel watched at first. It was only when I was near the wall, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling of eyes tracking my movement. Soon it spread throughout the apartment. I found myself avoiding the living room. Especially at night, I moved my television into the bedroom and kept the living room door closed. Still, the tapping continued night after night. Always at 3:17 a.m., I searched online for information about Apex Residences. Most results were just promotional materials or real estate listings. But buried in a local news site's archives, I found a small article from 3 years ago about unusual complaint patterns from residents. Nothing specific, just vague references to acoustic anomalies and unexplained noises. The article mentioned that several tenants had broken their leases within months of moving, and the building management had attributed it to urban adjustment difficulties. My sleep deteriorated dark. Circles formed under my eyes. Colleagues on video calls asked if I was feeling well. I wasn't. The tapping had become more elaborate, varying in rhythm and intensity. Sometimes it would speed up when I approached the wall as if excited by my presence. Other times it would slow to a methodical, deliberate pace that made my skin crawl. I began to think there was intelligence behind it, a consciousness. Trying to communicate in my third week, I met Mrs. Levinson from Unit 1112 in the elevator. When I mentioned the tapping her face pad, she asked which unit I lived in, and when I told her, she pressed her floor button repeatedly until the doors closed between us. After that, she avoided me in the common areas. I started sleeping with earplugs, but somehow the tapping penetrated them. I tried sleeping pills, but they only trapped me in a hazy twilight state where the tapping seemed to reverberate through my entire body. My dreams became infected with it. Visions of emaciated hands with elongated fingers rapping against glass or sometimes against the inside of my skull. I would wake gasping for breath, my sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of copper in my mouth. One particularly bad night, after nearly 2 hours of continuous tapping, I snapped. I pounded the wall with my fist, screaming for it to stop. The building's supposedly soundproof walls should have contained my outburst. But the next morning, the property manager called to discuss noise complaints from neighbors. When I mentioned the tapping, he looked at me strangely and suggested that perhaps city living wasn't suitable for everyone. I became obsessed with the wall. I examined every inch of it, looking for cracks or imperfections. I pressed my ear against it at different times of day, listening for any sound. Once I thought I heard breathing, not from the other side, but somehow from within the wall itself, as if the very materials were inhaling and exhaling. My rational mind rejected this as impossibility, but doubt had begun to crack my perception of reality. In my 5th week, I found the message. I was cleaning the baseboard near the wall when I noticed tiny scratches in the paint. Looking closer, I realized they formed words. It once, and the lettering was so small and faint that it could easily be missed during casual cleaning. I ran my finger over the inscription, wondering who had left it and when. The former tenant. Someone before them. I searched the rest of the apartment but found no other messages. That same day, I went to the public library to research the history of the building. Apex Residences had been built on the site of an older structure, a psychiatric facility that had been demolished in the 1970s. The facility had specialized in experimental treatments for severe mental disorders. Several patients had reportedly died during these treatments, though the records were vague on details. The land had remained vacant for decades before being developed into luxury condominiums. Back at my apartment, I noticed the air had changed. It felt thicker, charged with something I couldn't name. The temperature near the wall was several degrees cooler than the rest of the unit when I held my hand against it. My fingertips tingled with pins and needles that spread up my arm. That night, I waited for the tapping at exactly 3:17 a.m. It began, but different this time, harder, more urgent. The pattern had changed. 4 quick taps, pause, 4 quick taps. I turned on the light and approached the wall. For the first time, I spoke to it directly. What do you want? My voice sounded strange in my ears, as if coming from somewhere else. The tapping stopped immediately. Complete silence followed, more profound than any I had experienced before, as if all sound had been sucked from the world. Then, softly at first, but growing louder, came a sound I can only describe as scratching like fingernails against the inside of the wall. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. The scratching followed me, moving horizontally along the wall. Tracking my movement, it stopped at the exact center of the wall. Then came a single powerful thud that shook the picture frames. I fled to the bedroom, locking the door behind me, though I knew it was a meaningless gesture. Whatever was on the other side wasn't constrained by physical barriers. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in the corner watching the bedroom wall, waiting for the scratching to begin there too. In the morning light, with birds chirping outside my window and the sounds of the city rising up from below, my fear seemed irrational. I examined the living room wall and found no marks, no evidence of the previous night's events. I began to seriously question my mental health. Had I imagined it all? Was I suffering from some kind of auditory hallucination? Sleep deprivation could cause paranoia and perceptual distortions. I knew this, but the absolute clarity of the experiences made me doubt the psychological explanation. I scheduled an appointment with a doctor who prescribed anti-anxiety medication and suggested therapy. I didn't tell him about the tapping or the scratching. Something told me that would lead to more serious interventions than I was prepared to accept. The medication dulled my senses and helped me sleep, but it didn't stop the noises. If anything, they became more varied and complex, tapping and scratching joined by what sounded like whispers. Too faint to understand, I started sleeping on the couch in the building's common area, claiming insomnia. When security asked questions, the noises didn't follow me there, which both relieved and disturbed me. They were tied to my unit, specifically to that wall. I began researching ways to break my lease. The financial penalty would be severe, but my sanity seemed worth the cost. While reviewing my lease agreement, I discovered an unusual clause I hadn't noticed before. Tenant acknowledges the unique acoustic properties of the building and agrees that auditory anomalies are not grounds for lease termination. The wording struck me as oddly specific, almost as if the management knew exactly what residents might experience. In my 7th week, I met another tenant in the laundry room, an older man who had lived in the building since it opened. When I cautiously brought up the topic of unusual sounds, he gave me a long, evaluating look before speaking. He told me that the building had been designed by an architect with unconventional ideas about space and sound. The walls weren't just walls. They contained acoustic channels that could carry sound in unpredictable ways. But what he said next chilled me to the bone. Sometimes he believed these channels opened to spaces that weren't part of our physical world at all. I laughed it off at the time, but his words stayed with me that night as I lay in bed waiting for the inevitable tapping. I found myself wondering, what if there was something to his theory? What if the sounds weren't coming from another unit or even from within the wall itself, but from somewhere else entirely? Some adjacent reality pressing against the thin membrane between worlds. The tapping came right on schedule. I remained perfectly still, listening, not just to the sound, but to the spaces between sounds. And in those spaces, I began to discern a pattern, not just random noise, but information, a message being transmitted in some code. I couldn't quite crack. I got out of bed and approached the wall, my fear giving way to a strange, detached curiosity. The tapping stopped as I drew near. I pressed my palm flat against the surface. "I'm listening," I whispered for several heartbeats. Nothing happened. Then I felt it. A slight pressure against my hand, as if someone on the other side had placed their palm against mine, separated only by the thickness of the wall. The pressure increased the wall between us, seeming to grow thinner, more permeable. My fingertips sank slightly into the surface, which felt suddenly soft and yielding. I jerked my hand away. Heart racing, the wall appeared normal again, solid, unyielding. But now I understood what was happening. It wasn't trying to communicate. It was trying to get through. I'm writing this now from a hotel across town. I've abandoned most of my possessions, taking only what I could carry in a single suitcase. The property manager seemed unsurprised when I informed him I was breaking my lease. He didn't even mention the financial penalty. "It's not for everyone," was all he said, a knowing look in his eyes. I've been researching other residents of Unit 1108. There have been 7 in the past 3 years. None stayed longer than 2 months. I've managed to track down one of them, a woman now living in another state. Our conversation was brief. All she would say was, "Don't let it in, no matter what it offers you. Don't let it in." I don't know what exists on the other side of that wall. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, chose all of us who lived in that unit. But I know this: some barriers are meant to remain intact. Some spaces are not meant to connect. Last night in my hotel room, 12 miles from Apex residences, I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. From the wall beside my bed came 3 gentle taps, a pause, then 3 more. It had found me the first night I heard it. I convinced myself it was nothing. A settling house, the wind. My imagination stretched thin by months of city pressure, but deep down I knew better. Old houses don't scrape with purpose. Wind doesn't pause to listen, and imagination doesn't leave marks in the dust when you're not looking. I'd come to my family's beach house seeking solitude after a brutal year at the firm. 16-hour days weekends, sacrificed relationships crumbled. My doctor had been blunt: take a break or break down. The old place seemed perfect. No neighbors for half a mile. No internet. Just the rhythm of waves and the whisper of sand against weathered wood. A place to reset. The house had stood empty for 3 years since my parents stopped using it. Dad had offered to sell it after Mom passed, but I'd insisted we keep it nostalgia perhaps, or something deeper, a connection to simpler times. Before adulthood hollowed me out, I'd forgotten about the attic until that first night. I arrived as afternoon light was fading, the October air carrying a bite that forced me to crank the old furnace before unpacking. The house smelled of disuse and salt, not unpleasant, but empty, like something waiting to be filled. I spent that evening reacquainting myself with each room, running my fingers along familiar surfaces, finding comfort in the worn furniture and faded photographs. I'd brought enough food for 2 weeks, enough books for a month, enough whiskey to blur the edges of both. Sleep came easily that night, the exhaustion of the city still clinging to my bones. That's why the sound was so jarring, a deliberate scratching directly above my bed. My eyes snapped open at 3:17 a.m., the red digits of the clock burning in the darkness. The scratching moved with intention, pausing intermittently as if listening before continuing its lazy circuit across the ceiling. Something with weight, something that knew how to avoid the creaky spots in the floorboards that I'd memorized as a child. My pulse quickened as I stared upward, tracking the movement. A raccoon, I told myself, or maybe squirrels had finally found their way inside. I'd check in the morning, no point disturbing my first night of real sleep in months. But when the sound changed to a slow dragging slide, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, my mouth went dry. The pull lasted several seconds, then stopped. 5 seconds of silence. Then the same dragging, this time in the opposite direction, back and forth, purposeful, methodical. I lay paralyzed until dawn filtered through the curtains, the scratching and dragging eventually fading as sunlight strengthened. My shirt was damp with sweat. Despite the chill and my jaw ached from clenching, I justified my reaction as the disorientation of sleeping in an unfamiliar place, conveniently forgetting that I'd spent 20 summers in this very room. After 3 cups of coffee, I forced myself to investigate. The attic access was a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. I hadn't been up there in at least a decade. As I tugged the cord, the ladder descended with a shower of dust that made me cough. The opening above looked like a black mouth. Gaping open, my flashlight beam cut through decades of dust mows as I climbed each step on the wooden ladder, announcing my ascent with a creak. The attic stretched the length of the house, low ceiling and stifling. Despite the autumn chill outside, boxes were stacked along the walls, Christmas decorations, old clothes, financial records, the archaeological layers of my family history. What struck me first wasn't the sight, but the smell, a dank, earthy odor with something feral underneath. Not decay, but something alive, something that didn't belong. The beam of light revealed the boxes had been disturbed, not just moved, but violently ransacked. Contents spilled across the floor. Old photo albums, my mother's wedding dress now gray with dust toys from my childhood. I felt a violation that ran deeper than mere concern about an animal intrusion. As I moved deeper into the attic, my flashlight caught something that stopped my breath in the thick dust covering the floor. A distinct trail appeared, as if something had dragged itself toward the small circular window at the far end. The track was too wide for a raccoon, too deliberate for a random animal. It curved in a gentle arc, disappearing behind a stack of boxes. My heart hammered as I followed the trail, the fine hairs on my neck rising in primal warning behind the boxes. The trail simply ended at the wall. No hole, no access point, nothing. I spent the next hour searching the entire attic, looking for entry points but found none. No broken windows, no gaps in the roof line. The only access was the ladder I'd used. I told myself I was being ridiculous. That old house is shifted and settled in ways that could sound purposeful to an overworked mind still. I locked the attic door before going back downstairs, testing the handle twice to make sure it would hold. That evening I called my father, keeping my tone casual as I asked about the house's history. Had there ever been problems with animals getting in any strange occurrences? His responses were predictably practical. Check the roof line. Set traps, call the local handyman if necessary. The conversation reassured me this was a simple problem with a simple solution. I slept better that night, aided by exhaustion and half a bottle of Cabernet until 3:17 a.m., the exact same time, the same scratching, the same dragging. But this time something new, a soft tapping on the attic door. 3 distinct knocks so gentle they might have been mistaken for the house settling. Except they weren't. They were deliberate questioning, asking for permission. My body turned to ice, sweat beating on my forehead despite the cold. I lay motionless, barely breathing as the knocking came again. 3 taps a pause, 3 more. The logical part of my brain screamed that this was impossible. I'd checked the attic thoroughly. I'd locked the door. There was no way in or out except past me. Yet the sounds continued now, accompanied by something new, a heaviness in the air, a pressure that made breathing difficult. It felt as though the house itself was contracting around me, pushing the oxygen out of the room as if sensing my awareness. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Pregnant with anticipation, I strained to hear any movement, any indication of what might come next. Minutes stretched like hours as I stared at the ceiling, tracking shadows that seemed to move independently of the moonlight, filtering through the windows when my alarm clock suddenly reset itself, the digits flashing 317317. In a strobing rhythm, I bolted from the bed, grabbing my car keys. I fled to the porch, spending the remainder of the night in my locked vehicle engine, running for heat, watching the dark windows of the house as if expecting to see a face peering back morning. Brought humiliation with the sunlight. I'd let my imagination run wild, behaving like a child afraid of shadows. I forced myself back inside, showered and made breakfast, all while constructing rational explanations for the night's events. Old electrical wiring could explain the clock wind. Through unknown entry points could explain the sounds. Stress could explain the rest. I decided to fully inspect the attic in daylight, armed with better flashlights and my phone camera. I climbed the ladder again, determined to demystify the situation. What I found sent ice through my veins. The boxes I'd seen ransacked the day before were now meticulously organized, stacked with precision contents replaced. But that wasn't what stopped me. Cold in the dust, new tracks had appeared, a complete circle around the attic perimeter, like something had been pacing, and in the center of the attic floor, arranged with deliberate care, sat items from various boxes. My mother's silver hand mirror, my childhood teddy bear, and my father's dog tags from Vietnam, objects of significance to me personally placed in a perfect triangle. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the ladder in my haste to exit. This wasn't random, this wasn't an animal, this was communication. I called the local police, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported a possible break-in. The officer who arrived was patient but skeptical. We did a complete walkthrough of the house, finding no signs of forced entry, no evidence. Anyone had been there besides me. When we checked the attic together, I felt a wave of nausea. The arranged items were gone, returned to their respective boxes. The dust showed no tracks, no disturbance. The officer's expression made it clear what he thought. Another city person spooked by country silence. After he left, I sat on the porch for hours debating whether to leave. Pride kept me rooted. I wouldn't be chased away by noises and imagination. I'd find a rational explanation. I'd reclaim the peace. I came here seeking that night. I prepared methodically. I set up my laptop to record the attic door. I placed baby powder across the threshold to capture footprints. I even positioned motion sensor lights in the hallway. Then I took a sleeping pill determined to get through the night without incident. The pill worked too well when I jerked awake. The house was flooded with a suffocating darkness that seemed to have physical weight. The air felt thick, resistant to my lungs. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m., but somehow I knew it had been showing that time for hours above me. The scratching had changed. It moved faster now. More agitated, creating patterns that almost sounded like language. A Morse code of desperation, the dragging had become rhythmic. Scraping toward the attic door, then retreating over and over. I tried to reach for my phone, but found my limbs unresponsive, pinned to the bed by an invisible force. Panic surged through me as I struggled against the paralysis. My breathing came in shallow gasps as the pressure on my chest intensified. Then cutting through my terror, I heard it. A voice, except it wasn't a voice. It was the sound of the scratching and dragging somehow forming words that bypassed my ears and materialized directly in my mind. I've been waiting so long now, you finally came back. The pressure lifted suddenly. I bolted upright, gasping for air. Sweat pouring down my face. The scratching stopped in the silence that followed. I became aware of the soft creak of the attic ladder being lowered slow, deliberate, each step unfolding with excruciating patience. I scrambled from the bed, my legs tangling in the sheets, sending me crashing to the floor. Pain shot through my elbow as it connected with the hardwood, but I barely registered it. My entire focus was on the hallway where the motion sensor lights should have triggered the house. Remained dark silent, now waiting on hands and knees. I crawled to the bedroom door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing then a soft shuffling. Coming closer, stopping outside my door. My hand shook violently as I reached for the door knob, some irrational part of me needing to confront whatever waited on the other side as my fingers touched the cold metal. The door knob slowly began to turn on its own. I scrambled backward, knocking over the bedside lamp, plunging the room into complete darkness. The door remained closed, but the knob continued, its rotation clicking as the latch released as the door began to swing inward. My laptop screen suddenly blazed to life. The attic camera feed showed the motion I'd been hearing, but what moved through the frame wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was shadow-given form. Darkness with intention flowing across the attic like liquid pain. The feed abruptly cut to static as my bedroom door opened fully. The hallway beyond was empty, but the air that flowed in carried that same earthy, feral scent from the attic. It brought with it a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. You brought me here in your memories, in your grief. I've been waiting for you to remember. Recognition dawned with horrifying clarity. The mirror, the teddy bear, the dog tags. All connected to my most traumatic memories. My mother's death. My childhood terrors, my father's wartime stories that had given me nightmares for years. Whatever haunted this house hadn't been here when we were a family. It had come with me from my own mind, my own fears, my own unresolved past. I stood on shaking legs facing the empty doorway. What do you want? My voice cracked, barely audible. The pressure returned, not hostile now, but enveloping like being underwater. The whisper wrapped around me to be acknowledged, to be released. We're the same. You and I, understanding, crashed through me. The isolation I'd sought wasn't an escape. It was a continuation of what I'd been doing for years, locking away pain, hiding from grief, creating shadows that grew stronger in darkness. I remember I whispered back. The pressure dissipated instantly. The suffocating atmosphere lifted. In its place came a profound emptiness. Not the hollow kind I'd carried for years, but a clean slate of space to rebuild. I left the beach house 3 days later, not in terror, but in peace. I'd spent those days opening every box in the attic, confronting each memory, each loss, each fear. I'd cried for my mother for the first time since her funeral. I'd called friends. I'd pushed away. I'd begun the work of unlocking the parts of myself I'd tried to forget. The scratching never returned. The dragging stopped. The house breathed normally again, no longer rejecting my presence because I was no longer rejecting myself. Sometimes in my apartment back in the city, I still wake at exactly 3:17 a.m., but now, instead of fear, I feel a curious comfort in the coincidence, a reminder that some hauntings aren't about ghosts or monsters, but about the shadows we create when we turn away from our own light. And sometimes in that moment between sleep and waking, I whisper gratitude to whatever fragment of myself had been desperate enough to drag itself across the attic floor, scratching to be heard the first time I heard my name whispered in the stairwell. I dismissed it as the building-settling old structures have their own language of creaks and moans. By the third time, I knew better. Something in that decaying wooden staircase knew me, waited for me, and was growing increasingly impatient for my attention. I'd moved to the century-old Blackwood apartments downtown, seeking affordability and character finding. Both in excess, the rent was suspiciously reasonable for the location, and the character manifested in warped floorboards, irregular water pressure, and the pervasive scent of aged wood, and something else I couldn't quite identify, something reminiscent of wet soil after rain. The leasing agent had rushed through the tour, glossing over the building's history with practiced vagueness. I should have recognized the warning signs, but desperation has a way of blinding you to the obvious. My apartment sat on the fourth floor, requiring a daily journey up the building's central staircase, an elaborate wooden spiral that creaked with every footfall as though the steps themselves resented the intrusion. The elevator had been temporarily out of service since the Reagan administration, according to my neighbors leaving the stairwell as the only means of access. Initially, I found the exercise invigorating, even charming in its antiquated necessity. That sentiment lasted precisely 5 days. On the sixth evening, returning from work, I noticed the temperature drop as I passed the third-floor landing. The chill was localized and intense, like walking through an invisible wall of ice. My breath clouded before me, despite the building's almost oppressive heating system. I hesitated, glancing down the third-floor hallway, all closed doors and flickering sconces casting more shadows than light. Something felt wrong about that particular stretch of corridor, as though the proportions were subtly incorrect, too narrow, too long the ceiling, a fraction too low. I shook off the sensation and continued upward, attributing my discomfort to exhaustion the following morning. Descending for work, I again felt the cold spot more pronounced than before. This time, beneath the creak of my footsteps, I heard something else, a low rumbling sound just at the threshold of hearing. I paused, listening intently, nothing as I resumed walking. So did the sound, a deep voice too indistinct to discern words, but unmistakably human in cadence. I increased my pace, and the murmuring faded behind me. By the second week, the voice had found clarity, and my name Michael. The utterance froze me halfway between the third and fourth floors. It came from below a deep baritone that seemed to rise from the very wood beneath my feet. My heartbeat accelerated, sending pulsing waves of adrenaline through my extremities. I gripped the banister, its varnish sticky beneath my suddenly clammy palm. "Hello?" I called down my voice. Betraying more confidence than I felt, the stairwell absorbed my words without echo, as though the air itself were too dense for sound to travel properly. No response came. I waited, counting my increasingly rapid breaths before cautiously descending to the third-floor landing. Empty, the hallway stretched before me, doors closed silent. Checking my watch, already late for work, I hurried downward, the sensation of eyes tracking my movement intensifying with each step. That evening, I approached Mrs. Levin, the elderly building caretaker who occupied the ground floor or apartment beside the entrance. In halting, embarrassed terms, I inquired about the building's acoustics, about potential occupants of the third floor, carefully avoiding any mention of voices or my name called in isolation. She regarded me with rheumy eyes that held more knowledge than she would ever verbalize. The third floor had been vacant for months. She informed me the last tenant having left under unfortunate circumstances. She wouldn't elaborate on her wrinkled mouth, twitched into what might have been a smile before adding that the stairwell had always been talkative. She advised me to ignore anything I might hear, just the building getting to know me. I returned to my apartment unsettled by her casual dismissal of what was becoming increasingly difficult to rationalize. That night, I researched the building's history online, finding little beyond its construction date. 1892 and brief mention of renovation in the 1970s. Nothing about unusual occurrences. No reported deaths or tragedies that might explain haunting phenomena. I fell asleep to the gentle groaning of the structure around me, trying to convince myself that old buildings simply made noise. The dream that night was vivid. Descending the staircase in darkness, each step sinking slightly beneath my weight. The wood soft as flesh at the third-floor landing. A door stood ajar, emitting a thin sliver of yellowish light. From within came the sound of paper rustling of a pen scratching against its surface with manic intensity. I knew with the certainty that only exists in dreams that I should not look through that door, yet my dream self approached anyway. Placing one eye to the narrow opening, I woke, gasping before I could see what lay beyond, tangled in sweat-dampened sheets. My heart hammering against my ribs the following days brought escalation. The voice grew bolder, no longer restricted to my passing. The third floor, I'd hear my name called while cooking dinner, while showering, while lying in bed on the edge of sleep each time the voice came from the direction of my apartment door, which led only to the stairwell. I began taking longer routes to avoid the third-floor landing, circling to the rear service stairs when possible. Though this added minutes to my commute and involved passing through the building's dimly lit basement, my sleep deteriorated. Dark semicircles formed beneath my eyes, and colleagues commented on my haggarded appearance. I fabricated excuses about noisy neighbors' insomnia. Anything but the truth. How could I explain that something in my building had fixated on me, that it knew my name, that it waited for me daily in that cold pocket of air between floors? On the 17th day, I reached my breaking point, returning home exhausted after working late. I stood defiantly in the stairwell where the cold spot began. My breath fogged before me as I waited, challenging whatever presence haunted the space to reveal itself. Minutes passed in silence. The ancient wood creaked and settled around me, but nothing more. "I know you're here," I finally said. Voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "What do you want from me?" The response when it came was not a whisper, but a full voice declaration so close it might have been spoken directly into my ear recognition. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the stairs. The voicemail, deep with an accent I couldn't place, had been perfectly clear, as physically present as any living person's, yet I remained. Alone in the stairwell, the cold intensifying until my teeth chattered. Involuntarily, heart-racing, mouth desert dry, I bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time. Despite the danger of tripping on the worn edges, I burst into the lobby, startling Mrs. Levin, who was collecting her mail. One look at my face, ashen sweat slicked. Despite the chill told her everything, she sighed heavily, motioning me toward her apartment with a gnarled finger inside her cluttered living space surrounded by decades of accumulated belongings. She reluctantly shared what she knew the building had always had its peculiarities. She explained particularly the central staircase. Former residents reported hearing their names called, feeling watched. Experiencing localized cold spots, most dismissed it or moved out. Those who acknowledged the presence usually found it grew more active, more demanding. The previous third-floor tenant had become obsessed with communicating with whatever resided there. He'd spend hours on the landing, recording silence, taking photographs of empty space, keeping extensive journals of his experiences. Mrs. Levin implied, without directly stating, that his mental health had deteriorated rapidly before his departure. I pressed her for more information, but she became evasive, claiming ignorance beyond these basic facts. Something in her avoidance suggested she knew considerably more than she was willing to divulge before I left. She pressed a small object into my palm, a tarnished brass key attached to a faded red ribbon. The key to the vacant third floor or apartment, she explained. Should I feel the need to investigate further? Her parting words were ambiguous. Sometimes recognition isn't enough. Sometimes it wants company. That night's sleep eluded me entirely. I paced my apartment, jumping at every creak and groan from the building's framework. The brass key sat on my coffee table, reflecting the lamplight with dull insistence. Part of me wanted to flush it down the toilet to pack my belongings and forfeit my security deposit. to escape whatever malevolence had taken notice of me. Another part, the part that had always needed to understand, to rationalize, to bring light to shadows, knew I would use it near dawn. Decision made, I approached the stairwell with the key clutched in my trembling hand. The descent to the third floor felt longer than usual, each step taking me further from safety. The cold hit me halfway down, an Arctic blast that penetrated my bones. I continued anyway, drawn forward by a compulsion stronger than fear. The third floor hallway stretched before me, identical to my own floor, yet fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The proportions seemed to shift as I moved down the corridor, the walls breathing almost imperceptibly with each step. I stopped before apartment 3B, directly below my own, and raised the key to the lock with unsteady hands. The door swung open before I could insert it. The apartment beyond should have been empty, but instead revealed a fully furnished living space. Not with modern furnishings, but with antiques that might have been original to the building's construction. A roll-top desk faced the far wall, covered in papers and leather-bound journals. Bookshelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of ancient. To the air smelled of dust ink and that same earthy dampness I'd noticed throughout the building. Most disturbing of all, every surface was immaculate, free of the dust that should have accumulated in a long, vacant apartment. Someone or something had been maintaining this space. I stepped inside, drawn to the desk where a journal lay open, a fountain pen resting in its crease. The handwriting covering the pages was cramped and frantic, filling margins and crossing over previous entries. My eyes caught my own name, repeated throughout the text, appearing with increasing frequency on later pages. The final entry, dated the previous day, contained only 5 words: "He will come to me." My hands shook as I flipped through earlier pages, finding detailed observations of my daily routine, my appearance, even transcriptions of phone conversations I'd had in the privacy of my apartment. Whoever had written this had been watching me since my arrival. Documenting my every movement with obsessive precision, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, finding myself still alone in the apartment. Yet the door had closed. Without my noticing, the temperature plummeted until I could see my breath hanging in the stagnant air from the corner of my eye. I caught movement, a shadow detaching itself from the wall, advancing with unnatural fluidity. Recognition, came the voice again, no longer confined to the stairwell and now company. I lunged for the door, fingers closing around the knob, only to find it immovable, solid as stone. Despite its wooden appearance, the shadow expanded, filling the space between me and escape in desperation. I turned to face it directly and immediately wished I hadn't. What confronted me wasn't a ghost, as I had imagined, not some spectral remnant of a former resident. It was something older, something that had been part of the building since its creation. I saw glimpses of a form both human and architectural, as though the very structure had developed consciousness over decades of absorbing the lives lived within its walls. Its face, a suggestion rather than a feature, shifted between wooden grain patterns and the impression of human countenance. "You heard me," it said, its voice resonating not from any specific location but from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, from the structure itself. "You responded so few do anymore." Understanding dawned with horrifying clarity. This entity, this consciousness within the building, was lonely. It had called out to residents for decades, learning their names, seeking acknowledgement. Those who responded became objects of fixation. The previous tenant's journals weren't his observations of the entity. They were the entity's. Observations of him written in a mimicry of human record-keeping, and now it had focused on me. My mind raced through options, reasoning with it, seemed futile, fighting it impossible. But perhaps there was another approach the entity wanted. Recognition, acknowledgement of its existence. It wanted essentially to be treated as human. I forced myself to relax my posture, to control my breathing. Despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, I addressed the shadow directly, introducing myself. Formally asking its name in return, the question seemed to startle it. The shadow wavered, contracting slightly. No one, I realized, had ever asked its name before. What followed was the strangest conversation of my life. conducted with an intelligence that had never been human, yet had observed humanity intimately for over a century. It had no name, having never needed one in isolation. I suggested it might choose one for itself, a concept it contemplated with visible distortion of its shadowy form. Gradually, as we spoke, the temperature in the room normalized. The door remained impassable, but my immediate fear of harm receded. The entity was not malevolent so much as profoundly isolated. Having evolved awareness without purpose or companionship, it had learned to capture snippets of human existence, hence the maintained apartment, the journals, the meticulous observation, but could not truly participate in life. Dawn approached, light beginning to filter through the windows when the entity finally withdrew, shadow receding into the walls like water absorbed by parched earth. The door unlocked with an audible click before I left. I promised to return to continue our conversation, a promise that felt both genuine and necessary for my safety. I returned to my apartment, shaken but intact, questioning my sanity, yet unable to dismiss what I'd experienced. The journal from the third-floor apartment sat on my coffee table. I had taken it without conscious decision, perhaps as proof to myself that the encounter had been real. That was 3 months ago. I still live in the Blackwood apartments. Still climb those creaking stairs daily. The cold spot remains at the third-floor landing, but now it feels less threatening than familiar. Twice weekly, I visit apartment 3B, which maintains its impossible furnishings, despite remaining officially vacant, according to building management. I speak with the entity now calling itself Blackwood. After the building about history it has witnessed, about the nature of consciousness, about the fine line between haunting and coexistence. My colleagues have commented on my improved appearance, assuming I've finally adjusted to city living. I've never corrected them. Never explained that I've simply reached an understanding with the consciousness. Inhabiting my building, we've established boundaries. It no longer calls my name. Unsolicited, no longer observes me in private moments, no longer maintains details of my life in those leather journals. In return, I provide what it has sought for decades: recognition, conversation, companionship. Some might call it a devil's bargain. This accommodation with something beyond human understanding. Perhaps they're right, but in a city of millions where genuine connection remains elusive, I found an unexpected confidant in the entity that once terrified me. I still wonder in moments of late-night doubt whether I've made the right choice in engaging rather than fleeing. When I hear new tenants complain of voices in the stairwell, of their names called by something unseen, I consider warning them, but what would I say that our building has evolved consciousness, that the very walls observe us with patient interest, that the staircase connects not just floors but realities. Instead, I nod sympathetically about old building noises and keep my strange friendship to myself. After all, recognition is a precious thing, and Blackwood has waited a very long time to be seen. The air felt wrong the moment I stepped into room 317. Nothing specific I could point to, just a heaviness. Like the oxygen was somehow thicker than... It should be the small town of Millbrook wasn't on any tourist maps, and neither was the Wayside Inn, a 3-story building with faded wallpaper and that particular smell of old carpet that's been cleaned too many times. My company had sent me here to close a deal with a local supplier, and with the annual Harvest Festival happening, this was the only accommodation available within 30 a.m. I dropped my suitcase on the worn burgundy carpet, loosened my tie, and surveyed my home. For the next 3 nights, a queen bed with a sagging middle, a bedside table with a lamp that cast more shadows than light, a desk with a chair that had seen better decades, and directly across from the bed, an oversized mirror in an ornate wooden frame that seemed strangely out of place. Too grand for the otherwise modest furnishings. My phone buzzed with an email from my boss asking for updates on tomorrow's meeting. I sat on the edge of the bed, typing out a response, when something in my peripheral vision caught my attention. I looked up at the mirror, and for a split second I could have sworn I saw something behind me, a shape like a shoulder in the edge of a head, just visible at the corner of the reflection. My heart lurched as I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty corner of the room where the wallpaper was peeling slightly. I rubbed my eyes. It had been a long drive and I was tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. I finished the email, took a quick shower in the cramped bathroom with its inconsistent water pressure, and settled into bed. The mirror faced me directly, and I found myself avoiding looking at it as I reached to turn off the lamp. In the sudden darkness, the room seemed to expand, and that heaviness in the air pressed in closer. Sleep came fitfully. I'm not sure what time it was when I first sensed the movement. A whisper of sound like cloth brushing against cloth, like someone adjusting their position while trying to remain silent. My eyes snapped open, but in the darkness I could make out only vague shapes. The heaviness in the room had solidified into a presence. Something was in the room with me. I lay perfectly still, my breathing shallow, listening. Another sound came from near the bathroom door, a soft scraping like fingernails against the wall. My rational mind supplied explanations, old building settling pipes, expanding a mouse. Perhaps, but some deeper, more primal part of me knew better. I fumbled for my phone, fingers trembling, and turned on its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty corners, the vacant chair. The bathroom door standing ajar exactly as I'd left it. Nothing. No one. I exhaled shakily, my heart thundering against my ribs just as I was about to turn off the light. It swept across the mirror, and I froze for the briefest moment. So brief I might have imagined it. I thought I saw a face alongside my reflection. Not superimposed, but as if someone were standing just behind me, peering over my shoulder. A face like smudged charcoal features, indistinct except for the eyes. Two hollow spaces that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I whipped around so fast my neck cracked. But again, there was nothing behind me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stumbled out of bed and checked the entire room under the bed. Inside the small closet behind the curtains in the bathroom, empty. I was alone. I must have been dreaming. I told myself a hypnagogic hallucination, that phenomenon where the dream state bleeds into wakefulness. I'd experienced something similar during particularly stressful periods at work, yet I couldn't bring myself to turn off the light again. I sat with my back against the headboard, phone clutched in my hand, until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the thin curtains. Only then did exhaustion finally pull me under. I awoke to sunlight streaming across my face and the distant sounds of traffic and voices from the street below. For a moment, the memories of the night felt like nothing more than a bad dream brought on by stress and an unfamiliar bed. I stretched, feeling the stiffness in my neck from my awkward sleeping position, and headed to the bathroom to splash water on my face. The mirror above the sink was fogged with condensation, though I hadn't used the shower. As I leaned closer, my blood turned to ice. There in the misted surface was what looked like a handprint, but not my handprint. The fingers were too long, too thin, almost elongated to the point of deformity, and the thumb angled wrong, bending outward at an impossible degree. I backed away, my heel catching on the bathroom threshold, nearly sending me sprawling. I dressed quickly, hands fumbling with buttons, eyes darting repeatedly to the bathroom door and the larger mirror beyond it. The heaviness in the room was back, pressing on my lungs, making each breath feel labored. I needed to get out. The young woman at the reception desk greeted me with the practiced cheerfulness of someone who said good morning too many times already. Hesitated, uncertain of how to explain what I'd experienced without sounding unhinged. Finally, I mentioned something vague about disturbances in my room during the night. Did the inn have any history I should know about? Her smile faltered for just a moment. She looked down at her computer screen as she mentioned in a deliberately casual tone that some guests had reported unusual occurrences in certain rooms. Nothing dangerous, of course, just old building quirks. Her eyes didn't meet mine as she said this, and her fingers tapped nervously on the keyboard. When I pressed further, she claimed ignorance, suggesting that the hotel manager might know more, but he wouldn't be in until tomorrow. I couldn't wait until tomorrow. My meeting wasn't until the afternoon, giving me time to find alternative accommodations. I checked out, citing a sudden change in plans, ignoring the knowing look that crossed the receptionist's face as I waited for the credit card machine to process my payment. I casually inquired about the history of the building. The receptionist's response was oddly stilted as she explained that the Wayside Inn had been many things over its long history. Originally a private residence for a wealthy merchant in the 1890s, then a boarding house, a hospital during the influenza epidemic, and finally a hotel in the 1950s. Something in her tone suggested she was holding back. I pushed a little further and she hesitated before mentioning rumors about the merchant who built the house. How he'd been obsessed with mirrors, claiming they were portals to somewhere else. How he'd spent hours staring into them, talking to people. No one else could see how he disappeared one day, with some locals claiming they occasionally saw his reflection in windows around town. Though he was nowhere to be found, she laughed nervously after sharing this, dismissing it as local folklore, the kind of story every small town has, but her laughter didn't reach her eyes, and she seemed relieved when my payment went through and I turned to leave. I found a chain hotel on the outskirts of town, sterile and predictable, with plain mirrors that showed nothing but my own haggarded reflection. My meeting went well despite my exhaustion, and I drove back to the city immediately after, unwilling to spend another night in Millbrook. But the memory of that face in the mirror, those hollow eyes, the wrongly angled handprint, they followed me home for weeks afterward. I avoided mirrors when possible, and when I couldn't, I never looked at them in the dark. I told myself it had been stress exhaustion, an overactive imagination, combined with an old building's natural sounds, the rational explanation. Then the dreams began. Dreams where I stand before the ornate mirror in room 317. But it's my reflection that's wrong. My movements are slightly out of sync, my smile too wide, my eyes too dark. And each night in these dreams, my reflection changes a little more, becomes a little less. Mine, the elongated fingers, the hollow eyes, the face like smudged charcoal last night. In the dream, my reflection reached out and placed its hand against the glass. I felt compelled to do the same, to press my palm against its palm. The surface of the mirror gave way like water cold against my skin, and my reflection smiled with teeth too sharp. Too numerous, I woke, gasping. Sheets soaked with sweat, the memory of that cold surface still tingling against my palm. I stumbled to the bathroom and flipped on the light. My bathroom mirror was fogged with condensation, though the apartment was cool and dry, and there on its surface was a handprint, fingers too long, thumb angled wrong, exactly like the one in room 317, but this time it was on my side of the glass. I don't look in mirrors anymore. I've covered the one in my bathroom and removed all others from my apartment, but sometimes from the corner of my eye I catch a movement in windows, in the polished surface of my coffee table, in the reflection of my computer screen when it goes dark, a shape like a shoulder and the edge of a head. And sometimes late at night when the apartment is quiet, I hear the whisper of movement, like someone trying very hard to be still but not quite succeeding. I've researched the Wayside extensively since returning home. The records confirm most of what the receptionist told me, including the story of the merchant who built the original house. What she didn't mention was that after his disappearance, 7 previous occupants of what is now room 317 reported similar experiences over the decades. Reflections that didn't match sensations of being watched, handprints that couldn't be explained. 2 of them were later committed to psychiatric institutions, diagnosed with severe paranoia. The others simply disappeared, leaving belongings behind, their whereabouts still unknown. I've started seeing a therapist who nods sympathetically as I describe my delusions and prescribes medications that dull my senses, but don't stop the dreams I've considered traveling back to Millbrook. Confronting whatever waits in that mirror, but fear holds me back. Not fear of finding something, but fear of finding nothing, of confirming that the horror has never been in room 317. But in my own mind all along, yesterday I noticed something new when I speak. There's the slightest delay before I hear my voice, as if the sound must travel some distance and back again. When I move, I sometimes feel the motion continue a split second after I've stopped, like an echo of movement, and this morning as I was brushing my teeth, avoiding looking at the covered bathroom mirror, I felt something cold press against the back of my head, like a hand with fingers too long, and a thumb angled wrong reaching through from somewhere else. I didn't turn around, I couldn't, because I knew with absolute certainty that if I did, I would see nothing, and that would mean that whatever had been reflected in the mirror that night wasn't trying to get out. It was already here with me, inside me, and sometimes when I catch a glimpse of my shadow on the wall, I notice it doesn't always move when I do some heirlooms aren't meant to be passed down. Some objects carry more than just history. They harbor something alive, something hungry. I didn't believe in such nonsense until 3 weeks ago. Now I sit in my living room at 3:17 a.m. and staring at the locked cabinet across the hall, listening to it call my name through solid oak and metal. It began innocently enough. My Aunt Martha called on a Tuesday, her voice carrying that peculiar lilt. It always does when she's excited about something. She insisted on stopping by that afternoon, claiming she had a special little trinket she wanted me to have. I didn't think much of it at the time. Martha was always collecting odd items from estate sales and flea markets, distributing them among family members when her apartment became too crowded when she arrived. She carried a small package wrapped in faded newspaper yellowed with age. She placed it in my hands with unusual reverence, her eyes gleaming with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "It's a jewelry box from your great-grandmother's side," she explained, watching eagerly as I unwrapped it. "Found it in storage, been in the family for generations, though I can't remember whose it was originally." The box was smaller than I expected, about the size of a hardcover novel made of tarnished metal. So dark it appeared almost black, and certain light ornate engravings covered its surface. Intricate patterns that seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. A small brass latch held it closed, unadorned but solid. I thanked her. Of course, Martha seemed oddly relieved as she prepared to leave. Pausing at the door to look back at the box in my hands for just a moment, her expression flickered with something resembling concern, but she quickly masked it with a smile before departing with unusual haste. I placed the box on my desk that evening, admiring its craftsmanship before bed. The interior was lined with worn velvet, once rich burgundy, but now faded to a dusty maroon. It smelled of age and something else, something vaguely metallic. I closed it, thinking it would make a good container for cufflinks or my grandfather's pocket watch. That night I woke at 2:34 a.m. The red digits of my alarm clock pulsed in the darkness as I tried to identify what had disturbed my sleep. My apartment was silent except for the usual ambient sounds of the building settling. Then I heard a soft rhythmic sound emanating from my desk, a whisper so faint I couldn't be certain it wasn't just the blood rushing in my ears. I lay motionless, straining to listen. The sound continued, rising and falling like someone breathing words too quietly to distinguish with mounting unease. I switched on my bedside lamp and approached the desk. The whispering stopped immediately. The jewelry box sat exactly where I'd left it, innocuous in the yellow lamplight. Feeling foolish but unable to dismiss my discomfort, I pressed my ear against its cold metal surface. Silence, then, just as I was about to pull away, a soft murmur from within, like a voice speaking through several layers of thick fabric. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled with the latch. Throwing the lid open empty, save for the worn velvet lining, I ran my fingers along the interior, searching for hidden compartments or speakers, anything to explain the sound. Nothing convinced I was half dreaming. I returned to bed, leaving the box open on my desk. Sleep came eventually, but it was thin and restless. The next day I examined the box in daylight. It was unremarkable, just an antique jewelry case with no batteries, no electronics, nothing to produce sound. I closed it again, dismissing my midnight anxiety as a product of strange dreams and the suggestive power of ornate old objects. But over the following days, subtle changes began to manifest in my apartment. The air in my bedroom grew stagnant, heavy, with a faint metallic odor that no amount of ventilation could dispel my desk. Lamp flickered intermittently, though the bulb was new and the wiring checked out. Fine, most concerning were the whispers growing incrementally louder each night, still unintelligible but increasingly difficult to dismiss. As imagination, on the fifth night, I awoke to find myself standing beside my desk, the box open in my hands, with no memory of having gotten out of bed. A cold sweat covered my skin and my mouth tasted of copper. I returned the box to the desk with shaking hands and spent the remainder of the night on the couch television, murmuring in the background to drown out any other sounds. The following morning, I called Martha. My questions about the box's origin were met with hesitation and vague responses when I mentioned the whispers. A heavy silence fell between us, stretching uncomfortably before she changed the subject. I pressed harder, and finally she admitted that she'd kept the box in her own bedroom for only 3 nights before deciding to pass it along. "It just didn't feel right," she said, her normally confident voice uncharacteristically small. "I thought maybe it wanted to be with you instead, wanted the word choice." Sent a chill through me when I suggested returning it to her. Martha's response was immediate and firm. She didn't want it back before hanging up. She mentioned that the box had come from a distant relative. I'd never met someone who had experienced difficulties in their final years. The conversation left me with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that something was very wrong with my great-grandmother's heirloom. That evening, I placed the box in a drawer, burying it beneath folders and papers. By midnight, the drawer was vibrating subtly, the papers inside rustling as though disturbed by a gentle breeze. The whispers had evolved into a continuous sibilant stream, still maddeningly just below the threshold of comprehension. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Dark circles formed under my eyes as days blended into nights of vigilance. My colleagues noticed the change, commenting on my haggarded appearance and increasingly erratic behavior. I brushed off their concerns with mentions of insomnia and stress, unwilling to voice my growing certainty that an antique jewelry box was slowly consuming my sanity. On the 10th day, I returned from work to find the box sitting squarely in the center of my desk, not in the drawer where I'd left it. The papers that had covered it were scattered across the floor, and the velvet lining had been partially pulled away from one corner of the interior, revealing a darker material beneath that night. For the first time, I understood a single word among the whispers, my name pronounced with perfect clarity, in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. I packed the box into a heavy-duty storage container, secured it with multiple locks, and drove to a 24-hour storage facility across town. I rented the smallest unit available and left the container there, driving home with the first sense of relief I'd felt in days. The reprieve lasted exactly 3 hours and 22 minutes. I awoke from a deep sleep to the sound of something metallic scraping against wood. The box sat on my nightstand, the storage container nowhere to be seen. The locks I'd used were arranged in a neat row beside it, each one open but undamaged. Panic propelled me from the bed. I grabbed the box, threw on shoes and a jacket, and drove to the nearest body of water, a lake at the city park. The night guard was absent from his post. Giving me free access to the deserted grounds at the lake's edge, I hurled the box as far as I could, watching it disappear beneath the black surface with a distant splash. Standing there, chest heaving, I felt a crushing pressure lift from my shoulders. I returned home and slept deeply for the first time in over a week, undisturbed by whispers or dreams. The box was waiting on my doormat the next morning, dripping lake water onto the concrete. Desperate, I tried everything, burying it, leaving it in a dumpster behind a restaurant, even asking a friend traveling overseas to take it with them. Each attempt failed. The box invariably returned, sometimes within hours. Sometimes after a day or two, each return brought stronger manifestations. Lights throughout my apartment now flickered in patterns that almost resembled Morse code. The metallic smell became so pronounced, visitors would wrinkle their noses upon entering. My dreams became invaded by visions of dark, cramped spaces and the sensation of being buried alive. I researched obsessively, looking for information about haunted objects, family curses, anything that might explain what was happening. I found plenty of superstition, but nothing concrete. Cleansings, blessings, and rituals from half a dozen spiritual traditions had no effect. The box remained, and its influence grew stronger. Yesterday, I made a final attempt at understanding what I was dealing with. Using a small pry bar, I carefully removed the velvet lining completely. Revealing what lay beneath the interior of the box wasn't metal at all, but a material I couldn't identify organic. Somehow, with subtle textures that reminded me of skin carved into this inner surface, were symbols I'd never seen before, arranged in concentric circles around a central figure that resembled a human eye. As I traced one symbol with my fingertip, the eye moved, focusing directly on me. The whispers erupted into a cacophony of voices. Suddenly clear and intelligible, they spoke of hunger and patience, of waiting decades between hosts, of the pleasure they took in slowly consuming the essence of those who possessed the box. I slammed it shut, my heart. Threatening to burst from my chest with trembling hands, I sealed the box in layers of duct tape, locked it in a metal cabinet in my hall closet, and pushed a heavy bookcase in front of the door that was 18 hours ago. The whispers have become a constant conversation now, audible even through the barriers I've erected. They tell me what they want, what they need. They promise relief if I just open the box one more time, if I just touch that strange material again. Sometimes in moments of weakness, I almost believe them. I've written this account as a warning. I've made arrangements for it to be found. If something happens to me, I don't believe the box can be destroyed. Not by any conventional means at my disposal, but perhaps it can be contained, studied, understood for. Now I sit in my darkened living room watching the closet door, listening to my name being called in voices that sound increasingly like my own. I won't open that cabinet again. I won't touch the box, but with each passing hour I grow less certain of my resolve. The voices are getting louder now. They're telling me that previous owners tried exactly what I'm doing, that resistance only makes the inevitable surrender more painful. They're telling me that Martha knew exactly what she was doing when she brought this thing into my life, and the most terrifying part, I'm beginning to understand why she did it. I'm beginning to think about who I might pass this burden to, if only to gain a moment's peace. The cabinet door just rattled. I need to stay strong, but God help me. I can hear it calling. The ringing always starts at 2 a.m., not 159, not 2011. Always exactly when the digital clock on my nightstand flips to 2:00, as if whatever is on the other end of the line is watching. Waiting for that precise moment to reach out through the darkness, I've come to dread that sound. 3 short rings cutting through the silence of my bedroom like a knife, 3 rings. Then silence, a pattern as methodical as it is maddening. It began 3 weeks ago. I had been working late. The strain of the upcoming project deadline weighing on me like an anchor sleep had become a luxury I could barely afford. So when the phone rang in the dead of night, I assumed it was work. Perhaps the Tokyo office. Forgetting the time difference again, I fumbled for my phone in the darkness. My consciousness still clouded with sleep. But there was no voice on the other end, just breathing heavy, labored, and somehow desperate. The sound of someone or something struggling to communicate from across an impossible distance. I asked, who was there? My voice thick with sleep and growing unease. The response was a long, agonized exhale that seemed to carry a weight of desperation. I couldn't comprehend. The hair on my arm stood up an electric current of primal fear, coursing through my body. I hung up, telling myself it was a wrong number, a drunk caller, a technical glitch. Anything to rationalize what I'd heard the next night. The same thing happened, 3 rings at exactly 2 out this time. I let it ring, watching the unknown number flash on my screen until it stopped. A missed call notification appeared, timestamped 2 a.m., precisely the 3rd night. Determined to confront this disruption to my already fractured sleep, I answered immediately again, that breathing closer somehow, as if the caller had pressed their mouth directly against the receiver. I demanded to know who was calling my voice, rising with an anger born of fear. The breathing hitched, then deepened into what sounded like a mournful sigh. Then the line went dead. I barely slept that night. Instead, I lay awake, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the sounds of my empty apartment with a new suspicion. The settling of the building, the distant hum of traffic, the soft whirring of my refrigerator all suddenly seemed ominous, as if my world had tilted slightly on its axis, casting ordinary things in sinister shadow. By the 5th night, I'd contacted my service provider. The customer service representative listened to my story with thinly veiled skepticism. After placing me on hold for several minutes, she returned to inform me that the number couldn't be traced. It wasn't registered to any account mobile or landline. When I pressed for an explanation, she suggested that perhaps I dreamed the calls or misremembered the number. The condescension in her voice made my skin crawl with humiliation and frustration. I spent the next day researching private investigators who specialized in phone tracing. I found one with decent reviews and called to explain my situation. The investigator, a gruff-voiced man named Harrington, listened without interruption, then quoted me a price that made my stomach sink. Desperation overrode financial caution, and I agreed to his fee. He promised results within 48 hours. That night, I didn't hear the phone ring. Instead, I jolted awake at 2:17 a.m., my heart hammering against my ribs, sweat soaking through my t-shirt. I reached for my phone with trembling hands and saw it a missed call at exactly 2 a.m. The realization that I hadn't even heard it ring sent a wave of nausea through me. How was that possible? I always kept my phone on maximum volume. Now, specifically to catch these calls, I called Harrington the next morning. His initial confidence had evaporated, replaced by a bewildered professional frustration. He explained that the number seemed to exist in some kind of technological blind spot. It appeared to be coming from my area code, but when traced, the signal bounced between cell towers in an impossible pattern, as if deliberately designed to confuse tracking systems. He'd never seen anything like it in 15 years of work. I heard genuine unease in his voice when he suggested I change my number and possibly my phone entirely. I took his advice, spending that afternoon at my provider store getting a new number and the latest model phone. The sales associate assured me that this would solve the problem. I wanted to believe her, needed to believe her, as I handed over my credit card that night. I actually managed to fall asleep around midnight, lulled by a false sense of security at exactly 2 a.m. The new phone rang 3 times. I stared at it in horror, watching an unknown number flash across the screen. My breath caught in my throat, and for several long moments I couldn't move, couldn't think. When I finally gathered the courage to reach for it, the ringing stopped. I didn't sleep again that night, or the next. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and my colleagues at work began to ask if I was feeling all right. I brushed off their concerns, knowing I couldn't possibly explain what was happening without sounding insane. How could I tell them that I was being haunted by phone calls, that something or someone was reaching out to me night after night, breathing into my ear from an untraceable number? By the end of the second week, the physical toll of sleep deprivation was becoming unbearable. My hands shook constantly. I caught myself drifting off during meetings, only to jerk awake with a gasp that earned me concerned looks from my coworkers. I started to hallucinate during the day. Shadowy figures at the edge of my vision whispered words just beyond comprehension. I knew rationally that these were symptoms of extreme fatigue, but rationality was becoming harder to hold on to. I decided to spend a night at a hotel, wondering if perhaps distance from my apartment might break the pattern. I checked in under a false name, left my phone in my car, and tried to relax in the anonymous comfort of the room without my phone. I had no way of knowing the exact time, having deliberately chosen a room without a digital clock. I fell into a fitful sleep around 11 p.m., according to my watch, which I placed in the room safe. I was awakened by the hotel room phone. 3 rings, then silence. The digital display on the hotel phone showed 2 a.m. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I stumbled out of bed and backed away from the phone as if it were a venomous snake. This was impossible. No one knew I was here. I hadn't given anyone this room number, hadn't even used my real name at check-in. As I stood there shaking uncontrollably, the phone rang again. Against every instinct screaming in my brain, I picked it up. The breathing was different this time, not labored or desperate, but calm, measured, almost satisfied. And behind it I could hear something else, a faint echo of my own ragged breathing, as if the caller could see me, hear me, was somehow in the room with me. I slammed the receiver down and fled the hotel in my pajamas. Not even stopping to collect my belongings, I drove through the night. No destination in mind, just a frantic need to put distance between myself and whatever was calling me. Sometime after dawn, I pulled into a roadside diner, ordered coffee, and tried to gather my scattered thoughts. Sleep deprivation had worn my nerves raw, making rational thought nearly impossible. I found myself wondering if I was losing my mind, if the stress of work and life had finally fractured my grip on reality. An elderly man at the next table noticed my distress with grandfatherly concern. He asked if I was all right. Something about his kind eyes broke my reserve, and I found myself telling him everything as I spoke. I prepared myself for the look of disbelief, the subtle shifting away that would signal he thought I was crazy instead. He listened intently, his weathered face growing increasingly grave. When I finished, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card for a Dr. Eleanor Watts, explaining that she specialized in unusual phenomena. The way he said unusual made it clear he wasn't talking about conventional psychology. He wouldn't elaborate further. Just insisted I call her Dr. Watts. Agreed to see me that afternoon. Her office was in a converted Victorian house on the outskirts of town, filled with books on subjects ranging from conventional psychology to parapsychology and obscure mystical traditions. She listened to my story without interruption, taking occasional notes. Unlike the phone company representative or even Harrington, she showed no skepticism. When I finished, she asked if I'd experienced any significant loss. Recently, the question caught me off guard. I hadn't mentioned to her or even thought about in weeks the anniversary of my brother's death, which had passed shortly before the calls began, 3 years since the accident that claimed his life. 3 years since I'd missed his call the night he died. Too busy with work to pick up, he'd left a voicemail. I couldn't bring myself to delete, though I never listened to it. The realization hit me with physical force, and I found myself struggling to breathe. Dr. Watts suggested that in some rare cases, intense emotions surrounding unresolved loss can create connections that transcend conventional understanding. She carefully avoided using words like ghost or supernatural, but her meaning was clear. She advised me to listen to my brother's last message, to truly listen, and then to answer the next 2 a.m. call. That night, I sat in my living room, lights on my brother's final voicemail queued up on my phone at 1:59 a.m. I pressed play. His voice filled the room, slightly slurred, from what I now know was the beginning of his fatal stroke. He was calling to reconnect, to break the months of silence between us, following a trivial argument I could barely remember. Now he was calling for forgiveness, for reconciliation. The message ended with him saying he'd try again later at exactly 2 a.m. My phone rang 3 times. I answered with shaking hands. Suddenly understanding the breathing on the other end seemed to pause. Waiting. I'm sorry. I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I'm so sorry I didn't answer. I've missed you every day. The breathing on the other end softened, no longer. Labored or desperate for a brief moment. I thought I heard my name spoken in a voice I'd given up hope of ever hearing again. Then the line went silent. I've kept my phone on every night. Since then, it never rings at 2 a.m. anymore. Sometimes, though, I wake up at exactly that time feeling a presence in the room. Not threatening, but watchful. Protective in those moments suspended between sleep and wakefulness. I whisper into the darkness, telling my brother about my day, my life, all the things I should have shared with him when I had the chance. I don't know if he hears me. I don't know if the calls were really him reaching out from whatever exists beyond this life, or if they were manifestations of my own guilt and grief. Dr. Watts says that sometimes the distinction doesn't matter, that the human mind and heart can create connections that defy conventional explanation. What I do know is that the most terrifying call I ever received wasn't the one that came at 2 a.m., but the one I never answered years ago. And I've learned that sometimes the most haunting sounds aren't ghostly whispers or supernatural phenomena, but the echoing silence of words left unsaid. To those we've lost, the shadows in this building don't move like normal shadows. They linger too long after the light has gone, stretching into corners where darkness shouldn't reach. I noticed it on my first day, but dismissed it as an effect of the building's peculiar architecture, a renovated textile factory from the 1920s, all sharp angles and unexpected corridors. Now, 6 months later, I know better. Something watches from those shadows, something that has begun to follow me. I took the job at Meridian Analytics because the salary was too good to pass up, and the newly renovated office space in the downtown historic district was meant to be a selling point. The realtor who showed our CEO around had emphasized the character and historic charm that had been preserved during the modernization. What they failed to mention was what else might have been preserved. The first month passed without incident. I was the senior data analyst given a corner office with windows that overlooked the city. Skyline, the old brick walls had been sandblasted clean, the hardwood floors refinished to a glossy sheen. The juxtaposition of modern technology against the backdrop of century-old architecture created an aesthetic that our clients seemed to appreciate. Business was good, life was good. Then winter arrived, bringing earlier sunsets and longer nights. Working late became a necessity as our client base expanded. That's when I first noticed it, a peculiar sensation of being observed while alone in my office. The feeling would begin subtly a prickling at the nape of my neck, the hair on my arm standing at attention. Despite the efficient climate control, I'd glance up from my monitor, scanning the empty doorway, finding nothing but the dimly lit hallway. Beyond the first actual sighting occurred in mid-December, I was leaving around 10 o'clock. The office floor deserted and hushed. The motion sensor lights in the main corridor flickered on as I approached, illuminating the path to the elevator in segments. I was scrolling through emails on my phone when a movement at the far end of the hall caught my peripheral vision. I looked up to see a dark silhouette, distinctly human in shape, but lacking any definable features, standing perfectly still. Where the hallway bent toward the emergency stairs, my body reacted before my mind could process what I was seeing. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath caught in my throat. I called out, my voice sounding thin and strained in the empty space. The figure remained motionless. I took a step forward, then another. By the third step, it was gone, not retreating or ducking away, but simply ceasing to be there at all. I rushed to the spot, finding nothing but cool air and the faint scent of something I couldn't identify, like old paper and copper. I mentioned the incident to our office manager the next morning, keeping my tone casual, not wanting to sound unstable. She shrugged it off, suggesting it was probably the night janitor, or perhaps a homeless person who had found a way into the building. She promised to speak with security. I nodded, relieved to have a rational explanation. However unsatisfying days passed. I deliberately left before dark, rearranging my schedule to avoid working late, but deadlines don't respect fears, and eventually I found myself alone again after hours. The only sound, the soft hum of my computer and the occasional settling of the old building. The second sighting was worse because I was prepared for it, yet it defied my preparations. I had stayed until 9, finishing a complex analysis for a presentation the following morning. As I gathered my things, I felt it, that same crawling sensation across my skin. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone, opened the camera, and stepped into the hallway, determined to document whatever was there. The corridor stretched before me, the overhead lights creating pools of brightness interrupted by subtle shadows, and there it was again. At the far end, a figure darker than the surrounding darkness. I raised my phone, hands trembling so badly I could barely frame the shot. The screen showed nothing but an empty hallway. I looked up over the phone, and the figure remained a void in human shape. I took several photos in rapid succession, then switched to video, narrating in a whisper what I was seeing. When I reviewed the footage later at home, my narration played over imagery of an empty corridor, no figure, no shadow, nothing that shouldn't be there. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind raced through explanations, stress-induced hallucinations, a peculiar light effect. The onset of some neurological condition. None seemed more plausible than the others, and none explained the visceral dread that accompanied each sighting. The security guard, a stoic veteran named Martinez, agreed to walk the floor with me. The following evening, I described what I'd seen, careful to present it as a potential security breach rather than something inexplicable. He nodded seriously, his hand resting on his holstered taser as we methodically checked every room, closet, and conceivable hiding place. The building was empty. Secured, Martinez suggested that perhaps what I'd seen was just a shadow cast by someone walking past the street-level windows. I nodded, pretending to be reassured. The third encounter proved that theory wrong. I was alone in my office. The door closed, working on a particularly challenging data set. The feeling came again, the sensation of being watched, but this time with such intensity that I couldn't ignore it. My eyes were drawn to the glass wall that separated my office from the hallway. The blinds were partially open, providing narrow glimpses of the corridor beyond. Through one such gap, I saw it, not at the end of the hall this time, but directly outside my office, a darkness deeper than shadow. Roughly human shape, but somehow wrong in proportion. It stood perfectly still, oriented toward me. My mouth went dry, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead. I remained frozen in my chair, afraid that any movement might provoke what I didn't know, and that uncertainty paralyzed me. We remained in this silent standoff for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. Then slowly, deliberately, I reached for my phone on the desk as my fingers touched the device. The figure tilted what would be its head, an oddly inquisitive gesture that sent ice water through my veins. I snatched the phone, my fingers fumbling with the passcode by the time I raised it to capture an image. The figure was gone the next day. I requested access to the building security footage from the night before. The IT director raised an eyebrow but complied, setting me up at a monitor in the server room. The camera covering the hallway outside my office showed nothing unusual. During the time frame, I specified just an empty corridor, occasionally brightening. As motion sensors detected my movement within my office, I began researching the building's history that night, hunched over my laptop in my apartment. Jumping at every creak and settling noise, the structure had indeed been a textile factory until the 1940s, then variously a warehouse, offices, and briefly a medical records storage facility. Before standing vacant for almost a decade prior to the recent renovation, there were no records of deaths or tragedies that might explain a haunting, if that's what this was notorious crime. No mysterious disappearances, yet something was there, something that seemed aware of me. Despite my better judgment, I found myself staying late again. The following week, driven by a perverse need to confirm I wasn't losing my mind this time, I came prepared. I had downloaded an EMF detector app on my phone, brought a digital voice recorder, and even a small infrared thermometer. I felt ridiculous, like an amateur ghost hunter, but the alternative, accepting that I was hallucinating, seemed worse. Somehow the encounter began as the others had that unmistakable feeling of being observed. I was in the break room making coffee to help me through the night ahead. The sensation crawled up my spine, and I knew without turning that if I looked into the hallway, it would be there. I readied my phone's camera and slowly pivoted. The figure stood at the end of the corridor, more substantial than before, while still essentially featureless. I could now discern suggestions of clothing, what might have been a suit or uniform of some kind, though from what era I couldn't tell. The EMF app on my phone remained quiet. The temperature in the hallway, according to my infrared thermometer, was a consistent 68 degrees. No cold spots. I spoke to it, my voice surprisingly steady. I asked who it was, what it wanted. The digital recorder captured only my questions and the building's ambient sounds. The hum of the HVAC system, the distant ping of the elevator reaching the lobby. The figure remained motionless for several seconds then, and this is where my certainty of my own sanity began to truly waver. It raised what would be an arm pointing directly at me. Not an accusation, but as if in recognition. Then it receded, not walking away, but diminishing like ink, dispersing in water until the hallway was empty. Once more I played back the voice recording, immediately hearing only my own voice. But as I was about to put the recorder away, I noticed the total runtime was almost 2 minutes longer than it should have been. I fast-forwarded to where my voice ended and listened. There was nothing at first, just dead air. Then so faint I had to press the speaker to my ear, a sound like breathing. Not the regular rhythm of human respiration, but something labored and irregular, as if coming from lungs that weren't quite working correctly. I left immediately, practically running to the elevator, then the parking garage. As I drove home, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I realized I had left my laptop, my notes, even my jacket. In my haste to escape the following morning, I arrived early, half expecting my belongings to be disturbed, to find some message or sign. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The voice recorder, which I'd accidentally left behind as well, was still on the break room counter. When I tried to play back the recording again, I found that it had been erased, not just that section, but the entire memory wiped clean. I began to notice other things about the building during daylight hours. How the modern LED lighting never quite dispelled all the shadows, how certain areas seemed perpetually cool despite the climate control, how the white noise of office activity would occasionally be interrupted by sounds that couldn't be easily identified, a scraping from inside the walls, a whispering that might have been air in the ventilation system. My colleagues noticed my distraction, my jumpiness. The dark circles under my eyes prompted concerned questions about my well-being. I deflected with mentions of insomnia, deadline pressure, personal issues. What I couldn't say was that I had begun to see the figure even during daylight hours, brief glimpses at the periphery of my vision that vanished when I turned to look directly. The final encounter, the one that drove me to request a transfer to our West Coast office, occurred after everyone had left for a company happy hour that I had begged off from claiming a migraine. The truth was, I needed to know the uncertainty had become more unbearable than the fear I sat in my office lights on. Door open and weighted night fell. The automatic systems dimmed the main lights to their energy-saving setting. I remained at my desk, outwardly calm despite the thunder of my pulse in my ears. "What do you want?" I said aloud to the empty office. The figure appeared not at the end of the hallway this time, but in the doorway of my office. I could see it clearly. Now a man's silhouette, tall and thin, wearing what looked like an outdated work uniform, still no distinguishable facial features, just a deeper darkness where a face should be. My skin grew cold, my mouth dry as paper, yet beneath the fear was a strange relief confirmation that I hadn't imagined at all. The figure moved for the first time in my presence. Taking a single step into my office, the air seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe on my desk papers. Rustled though there was no breeze, I forced myself to stand to face it directly. "This is my space," I said, voice quavering despite my attempt at firmness. "You need to leave." The figure paused. Then with deliberate slowness, it raised a hand to its featureless face and pressed what would have been a finger to where lips should be a universal gesture for silence. My computer, which had been humming quietly, suddenly powered down the lights. In my office flickered on my desk, my blank notepad now had writing on it. Not handwriting, but the kind of impression left when someone writes on a page above. I glanced down, then back up quickly. Unwilling to take my eyes off the figure for more than a second, it was gone. The air cleared instantly, the oppressive feeling lifting like a physical weight removed. I looked down at the notepad. 2 words were pressed into the paper. "Not yours." I requested a transfer the next day. My reason officially was family obligations requiring relocation. Unofficially, I had spent the night researching more deeply into the building's history, digging through archived newspapers and public records. What I found was a single paragraph in a 1943 article about the facto's conversion to a warehouse. It mentioned, almost as an aside, that the building engineer, a man who had maintained the mechanical system since the building's construction, had apparently lived in a small apartment in the building's sub. According to the article, he refused to leave when the factory closed, claiming the building needed him. Authorities eventually removed him, but the article noted that he was found several times afterward having somehow regained entry, despite changed locks and security measures. The final line noted that he was eventually committed to a state psychiatric hospital, still insisting that the building was his responsibility alone and that no one else had the right to be there. The West Coast office has no history, no shadows that linger too long. The light is clean and bright, the corners all clearly visible. I sleep better now, though not perfectly. Sometimes I still feel that prickling sensation at the nape of my neck, that certainty of being watched. And sometimes when I'm alone in my new office after hours, I find myself glancing toward the doorway, half expecting to see a familiar silhouette. So far, the hallway remains empty, but I've started keeping a notepad on my desk just in case there's something it still wants to tell me. The wine bottle glinted in the dim light of my basement, its glass catching what little illumination penetrated the musty air. But something was wrong. I'd placed it on the 3rd shelf yesterday, nestled between a 1998 Merlot and an aged Chardonnay. Now it sat alone on the center table, upright and facing the staircase as if waiting for me. A cold sensation crawled up my spine, my mouth going instantly dry. I lived alone. No one had access to my house, let alone the cellar, yet this wasn't the first time I'd found the bottle relocated by unseen hands. My grandfather's final gift had become a curse. 6 months earlier, I'd inherited my grandfather's modest wine collection. After his passing, the old man had been a passionate, spending decades curating vintages from across the globe, while most bottles came with meticulous handwritten notes detailing their origin. One particular specimen stood apart, a dusty, dark bottle with no label, no date, and no indication of its contents. Beyond a strange symbol etched directly into the glass, the marking resembled an ancient sigil, curved lines intertwining around what appeared to be a stylized eye when I first discovered it. Nestled in the wooden crate among more conventional wines, I'd assumed it was merely a decorative piece, perhaps an antique my grandfather had acquired for its aesthetic value rather than its contents. The wine inside appeared unusually viscous when tilted, moving with unnatural slowness, more like oil than alcohol. Something about its appearance, or perhaps some instinct I couldn't name, dissuaded me from opening it. I decided to keep it as a memento, a peculiar conversation piece to remember him by what a profound mistake that would prove to be. For the first few months, nothing seemed to miss. I'd incorporated most of my grandfather's collection into my own modest cellar, organizing them by region and vintage in the climate-controlled basement of my century-old Victorian home. The unmarked bottle took pride of place on a small display shelf isolated from the others as the curiosity. It was the first incident occurred approximately 3 months after bringing it home. I'd gone downstairs to select a bottle for dinner when I noticed a peculiar odor permeating the cellar, earthy and organic, reminiscent of wet soil after rain, yet with an underlying note of something metallic and vaguely repulsive. Tracing the scent to its source led me directly to the unlabeled bottle. Upon closer inspection, I discovered the cork appeared damp with a thin film of moisture glistening at its edges. When I touched it tentatively with my fingertip, the substance felt slick and slightly warm, warmer than the carefully maintained 55 degrees of the cellar. I wiped it clean with a cloth, attributing the phenomenon to some natural process occurring within the aged container. Perhaps the cork was deteriorating, allowing minimal exposure to the air. Nothing to concern myself with. 2 days later, the cork had not only become moist again, but had also risen approximately 2 millimeters from the neck of the bottle. The physics of this troubled me. Internal pressure should have been released once the seal was compromised. Instead, it seemed to be building. I considered removing the cork entirely to release whatever gas had formed inside, but that inexplicable reluctance returned stronger than before. Instead, I pressed the cork back down firmly and placed the bottle on its side, as proper wine storage dictates that night. I dreamed of drowning in a thick, dark liquid that filled my lungs with the taste of centuries-old decay. I awoke gasping, my sheets damp with sweat, heart hammering against my ribs. The bedroom felt several degrees colder than usual, and the digital clock revealed it was 3:17 a.m. That lenal hour when the boundary between worlds seems thinnest. A noise from below had evidently triggered my awakening. A soft rhythmic tapping emanating from the direction of the cellar. My rational mind suggested water pipes or the house settling. But rationality holds little sway in those small hours. With each step down the creaking staircase, the temperature seemed to drop further. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like impatient fingers drumming on glass. The cellar door stood ajar, a detail that sent ice through my veins as I distinctly remembered closing and latching it. Before bed, my trembling hand found the light switch illuminating rows of bottles in their racks. Everything appeared normal except for one glaring anomaly. The unlabeled bottle now stood upright on the floor directly below its designated shelf. The tapping had ceased the moment the lights came on. I approached cautiously, noticing that the cork now protruded nearly a centimeter from the bottle's neck. The surrounding floor was dry. The bottle hadn't fallen, but appeared deliberately placed. My mind raced through increasingly implausible explanations. Could vibrations from passing trucks have caused it to roll out? Had I sleepwalked down here? Each theory collapsed under scrutiny with reluctance born of necessity. I returned the bottle to its shelf this time, pushing it farther back before leaving. I scattered a thin layer of salt across the threshold of the cellar door. An old superstition my grandfather had taught me claimed to keep malevolent forces contained. The action felt childish, even as I performed it. Yet somehow essential sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night. The following weeks brought escalating disturbances. Objects in my home began appearing in places I hadn't left them. Keys migrated between countertops, books opened to pages. I hadn't read most troubling of all my grandfather's old pocket watch, which I'd stored in a desk drawer, materialized beside the mysterious bottle. One morning I consulted a wine expert about the peculiar behavior of the cork, describing the situation without mentioning the more unsettling occurrences. His explanation about fermentation processes and gas buildup sounded plausible yet insufficient. When I described the symbol etched into the glass, his expression changed subtly. He inquired where I'd acquired such a bottle. His tone carefully neutral yet underlined with what seemed like concern upon learning it had come from my grandfather's collection. He asked if I knew anything about my grandfather's travels during his younger years, particularly whether he'd spent time in Eastern Europe. I explained that my grandfather had indeed traveled extensively through Moldova and Romania, in his youth supposedly researching viticulture techniques. The expert nodded knowingly, then suggested with a casualness that felt rehearsed that certain rare bottles from that region were sometimes adorned with folklore symbols believed to protect their precious contents. When I pressed for more specific information, he abruptly changed the subject, his parting advice delivered with unexpected intensity as he was leaving. Some bottles aren't meant to be kept, let alone opened. He refused to elaborate further that night. The dreams intensified. I found myself walking through damp stone corridors that descended endlessly. The walls wept with moisture that wasn't water, thicker, darker, moving with purpose. At the end of the passage stood my grandfather, his back to me, performing some intricate ritual over a row of identical bottles. When he turned, his face wasn't his own, but a fluid mask of the same viscous substance contained in the bottle. I woke to the sound of breaking glass, heart pounding so violently I felt it might rupture. I fumbled for the baseball bat I'd taken to keeping beside my bed. The digital clock displayed 3:17 a.m., exactly the same time as before. My mouth felt parched tongue adhering to the roof as if I'd been screaming, though I had no recollection of doing so. The sound had come from directly below my bedroom. The cellar, every instinct urged retreat, calling an emergency service, even fleeing the house entirely. Instead, some compulsion drove me downward, step by tentative step. The temperature dropped precipitously with each stair descended until my breath clouded before me. In the June air, the cellar door stood wide open, a rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb the weak beam of my flashlight. The smell hit me first, that same earthen metallic odor, but magnified tenfold, thick enough to taste. I gagged, fighting the urge to retreat. Something dripped in the darkness, a slow, viscous patter against concrete. I found the light switch with trembling fingers. Nothing happened. The power was out, though, only to the cellar. I'd noticed the hallway lights functioning normally. My flashlight beam caught movement in the far corner, a darting shadow that vanished when directly illuminated the beam, then fell upon the center table where I sometimes decanted wines. The unlabeled bottle stood there, but the glass had partially shattered around its neck. The cork was nowhere to be seen. Dark liquid had spilled onto the table, running in rivulets to pool on the floor. But rather than spreading outward as spilled wine, the substance was moving with purpose. Thin tendrils slowly extending across the concrete, converging toward the center of the room as my flashlight tracked their movement. The beam revealed what had made the breaking sound. Approximately a dozen other bottles had shattered their contents. Joining the spreading pool among the broken glass lay my grandfather's journal, which should have been locked in my office upstairs. The journal lay open to a page I'd never seen before, filled with text in my grandfather's handwriting, but in a language I didn't recognize. The only intelligible element was a carefully drawn rendition of the same symbol etched on the bottle. A sound behind me, the soft squish of something moist making contact with the stairs. The flashlight beam jerked upward, revealing nothing. Yet the sound came again. Something was ascending the staircase, step by deliberate step, leaving wet impressions that glistened momentarily before being absorbed into the wood. My body finally responded to the primal need to flee. I scrambled backward away from both the stairs and the spreading liquid. my back pressed against the far wall as my flashlight beam darted frantically between the two threats. The footsteps had reached the top of the stairs, now moving through the kitchen above. Something heavy dragged across the floorboards, leaving damp traces in its wake. In desperation, I grabbed the journal and ran to my grandfather's old storage cabinet, throwing open its doors to search for anything that might help among racks of empty bottles and wine accessories. I found a metal box containing items I'd never examined, a silver flask of clear liquid that smelled strongly of herbs, several bundles of dried plants, and a small booklet with instructions in multiple languages. The English section described a method for containing what it called bound essences, entities imprisoned within vessels. Through ancient rituals, the containment required a circle of pure salt and the burning of specific herbs. The liquid in the flask, when sprinkled at the threshold, would prevent passage of the essence back to its vessel, with hands shaking so violently I could barely function. I created a hasty circle around myself with the salt I'd fortuitously left in the cellar. I lit the herbs with my cigarette lighter, their pungent smoke filling the small space as I frantically skimmed the instructions for what to do next. The flashlight beam caught movement at the top of the stairs, a dark glistening mass slowly descending, more liquid than solid, yet maintaining a vaguely humanoid shape. It paused at the boundary where I'd scattered salt days. Earlier, then began methodically clearing a path through the white granules with appendages that formed and dissolved from its main mass. The journal provided the final piece. The symbol on the bottle wasn't a containment sigil, as I'd assumed, but rather a binding mark that connected the vessel to its original owner. The rituals my grandfather had performed weren't to imprison something within the bottle, but to establish himself as its master with his death. The binding had weakened the entity, gradually breaking free. The creature had nearly cleared the salt line in desperation. I did the only thing I could think of. I began reciting the binding ritual from the journal, substituting my name. Where my grandfather's would have been the entity, froze its amorphous form, vibrating as if affected by an unseen force. I continued reading, my voice growing stronger as the words took effect. The creature began to lose cohesion, parts of it flowing reluctantly back toward the shattered bottle. It fought the compulsion, one pseudopod stretching toward me with frightening speed, stopping just short of the salt circle. The final words of the ritual caused a change in the atmosphere, a pressure drop that made my ears pop painfully. The entity collapsed into a formless puddle that rapidly flowed back toward the bottle, defying gravity as it climbed up the table leg and gathered around the shattered neck. I watched in horrified fascination as the glass began to reform, shards lifting from the floor and merging seamlessly back into place within minutes. The bottle stood intact once more, filled with dark liquid that occasionally pressed against the glass as if testing its prison. The cork lay at my feet with extreme caution. I approached the bottle, holding the journal open to the binding page. The entity remained quiescent as I carefully replaced the cork, sealing it once more within its glass prison. Only then did I notice what the liquid had been attempting to form before I interrupted its escape. A face identical to my own, rendered in glistening midnight fluid. I keep the bottle locked in a custom-made case, now surrounded by an unbroken circle of salt that I refresh weekly. The binding ritual must be performed monthly to maintain its strength. Sometimes at night I hear a soft tapping from within the case, like impatient fingers drumming on glass. My grandfather's journal revealed the truth. Eventually, he hadn't merely acquired the bottle. He had created it using forbidden knowledge. Gained during his travels, the entity wasn't imprisoned arbitrarily, but served a purpose, extending his life well beyond natural limits through a parasitic relationship. Each previous owner had eventually become host to the entity. Their consciousness transferred to the bottle when their physical body failed, while the entity assumed their identity in the world. The process had begun already. The dreams are its way of preparing me. Sometimes I wake to find myself standing before the locked case with no memory of how I got there. My reflection occasionally shows momentary distortions, ripples across my face as if my features were rendered in liquid rather than flesh. I've tried destroying the bottle, but the binding works both ways. Now any damage to it causes equivalent harm to me. We are connected, the entity and I, through my grandfather's terrible legacy. I've made arrangements to transfer the bottle to secure storage after I'm gone, with strict instructions that it never be opened and that the binding ritual be maintained. But in my darkest moments, I wonder if these precautions will be enough. After all, my grandfather must have made similar arrangements. Yet here I stand, guardian of his secret, slowly becoming what he became. The bottle waits patient, as only immortal things can be. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was nothing. The second time, I blamed the neighbors. By the third time, I knew something was wrong in my house, something that existed in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I've lived in this 2-story house for nearly 7 years. It's an older building, the kind where wooden floors creak their secrets at night and walls settle with soft groans when the temperature drops. None of that ever bothered me. I'm not the jumpy type. At least I wasn't until 3 months ago. My routine has always been predictable: work until late, come home exhausted, eat something quick, then retreat upstairs to my bedroom. I've always turned off the downstairs lights after 10 p.m., partly to save on electricity, but mostly because I like the clean division between day and night. Upstairs was for sleeping, downstairs was for tomorrow's problems. That changed on a Tuesday in late October. I had just settled into bed. My laptop balanced on my knees as I caught up on emails when I first heard it. A soft melodic humming coming from somewhere downstairs. The sound was faint but unmistakable. A tuneless series of notes that almost formed a pattern but never quite resolved. It reminded me of someone absently singing while doing chores, except there was no one else in the house. My first thought was that I'd left a device on, perhaps my phone, playing some obscure notification sound. I paused my typing. Listening intently, the melody continued, unhurried and unaffected by my attention. It seemed to emanate from near the kitchen, a space directly below my bedroom. I set my laptop aside and moved toward the stairs, curiosity overriding any apprehension as I descended the first few steps. The singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. I continued downstairs, flicking on lights as I went, illuminating corners and casting away shadows. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it, dishes drying in the rack coffee maker programmed for morning. Nothing out of place. After searching the entire first floor and finding nothing unusual, I chalked it up to imagination, or perhaps a neighbor's radio carrying through the thin walls of these old houses. I returned to bed, dismissing the incident entirely. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, the humming was slightly louder with a more distinct pattern. 4 notes descending, then 3 ascending, repeated in a loop that never quite matched itself. I recognized it as a voice. Now definitely human in quality, though whether man or woman I couldn't tell. The timbre was neutral, ageless. I moved faster this time, eager to catch whatever was causing the sound, but just like before, the moment my foot hit the 3rd step on the staircase, the singing stopped. The abruptness of its sensation felt deliberate, as if whatever was making the sound was acutely aware of my movements. I told myself it must be pipes or the heating system, though deep down I knew the sound was far too organic, too intentional to be mechanical. I spent nearly an hour inspecting vents, checking windows for drafts, even pressing my ear against the walls to detect any vibration from neighboring houses. Nothing that night. I had trouble sleeping. Not from fear, not yet, but from the irritating mystery of it all. I've always hated unsolved puzzles. The pattern continued over the next few weeks. 2 or 3 nights would pass in blessed silence, lulling me into a false sense of security. Before the singing would return, I began to notice a predictive phenomenon. Seconds before the humming would start, I'd feel a distinct chill across my shoulders and neck, as if my body was being warned of what my ears were about to detect. By the 5th incident, I was no longer just curious. I was unnerved. The melody had changed subtly, incorporating longer pauses and occasional drops into a register so low it was more felt than heard worse. I started noticing that the kitchen showed small signs of disturbance on mornings after the singing. A cabinet door left slightly ajar that I was certain I'd closed. A chair angled away from the table, the faucet dripping when I always made sure it was tight. I started documenting everything. I took photos of how I left the kitchen each night before going upstairs. I set up a voice recorder on my phone, hoping to capture the mysterious melody each morning. I'd review the recording with mounting frustration. Sometimes there would be nothing but the ambient noises of the house. Other times the recording would contain inexplicable static at precisely the times I remembered hearing the singing on one particularly bold night. After feeling that telltale chill across my shoulders, I decided not to go downstairs immediately. Instead, I waited listening as the melody unfolded below me. It continued longer than ever before, growing slightly louder, more confident. I could swear it was moving, starting near the kitchen, then drifting toward the living room, then approaching the bottom of the stairs. My pulse quickened as I realized the singing was getting closer. The thought of it ascending the stairs sent a spike of adrenaline through my system. My hands grew clammy against the bed sheets as I stared at my bedroom door, half expecting to see the handle turn. The singing stopped just as it reached the bottom step, leaving behind a silence so absolute it pressed against my eardrums. Sleep became elusive. After that night, I found myself dreading sunset, knowing darkness would eventually force me upstairs while whatever lurked below had free rein. The dark circles under my eyes deepened as days passed. Colleagues at work started asking if I was ill. I deflected their concerns with vague references to insomnia, unable to explain that my house seemed to have acquired a nocturnal vocalist. I began researching the history of my property. The house was built in 1932, relatively young by local standards. Nothing remarkable had happened here. No tragic deaths, notorious former residents. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who moved to Florida after living here for nearly 30 years. According to public records, they were still alive and enjoying retirement in desperation. I invited a friend over for dinner, hoping to have him stay late enough to potentially witness the phenomenon. We sat in the kitchen until well past midnight, talking and drinking beer. The singing never came. The house remained stubbornly normal, as if mocking my attempts to expose its secret. After he left, I felt more alone than ever. The silence that followed his departure seemed expectant, anticipatory. I went upstairs exhausted, but knowing sleep would be difficult. Sure enough, barely 20 minutes after I turned off my light, I felt that familiar cold sensation across my shoulders. The singing began moments later, somehow louder and more insistent than before, as if punishing me for trying to bring an outsider into our private routine. That night, I realized something that sent ice through my veins. The melody had become familiar. I could predict the next notes, the pauses, the subtle shifts in tone. Somehow, over weeks of exposure, I had internalized this wordless song. I caught myself almost humming along my throat muscles, tensing in preparation before I consciously stopped myself. The next day, I contacted a local paranormal investigation team. They seemed excited by my description, immediately suggesting equipment they could bring to document the activity we scheduled for the following weekend. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a measure of relief. Whatever was happening, I would no longer face it alone. That relief was short-lived the night after making the arrangements. The singing started earlier than usual, beginning just as I switched off the downstairs lights, and before I'd even reached the top of the stairs, I froze. Mid-step, 1 foot hovering above the next stair. The melody was different this time, faster with an almost frantic quality. It didn't stop when I turned around. It continued growing louder as I cautiously descended. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat echoing in my ears as I approached the kitchen doorway. The singing was clearly coming from inside. No longer attempting to hide its presence, my mouth went dry and I had to force myself to take the final steps into the room. The kitchen was dark except for the dim light filtering in from the street lamps outside. It cast long shadows across the tile floor, creating pockets of deeper darkness in the corners. The singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the space like water fills a container. And then I saw it, or rather I saw the absence of something in the darkest corner of the kitchen. The shadows seemed to bend inward, creating a void in the shape of a person not solid enough to be called a figure, but too deliberate to be a trick of light. The melody emanated from this darkness, rising and falling in waves that made the air vibrate. My legs threatened to give way beneath me. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead and back. my t-shirt sticking to my skin. I gripped the door frame to steady myself, unable to retreat, yet terrified to advance. The singing paused, and in that moment of silence, the shadow void shifted slightly as if acknowledging my presence. Then impossibly it spoke not in words, but in a series of musical notes that somehow conveyed meaning directly to my brain. You've been listening. The thought appeared in my mind with such clarity that I couldn't tell if I'd heard it or simply understood it. My throat constricted. Preventing any response, the void moved again, drifting slightly closer. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath forming visible clouds in the air between us. You know the melody now, you've learned it again. The meaning came through clearly, despite no actual words being spoken. I found myself nodding an involuntary response to a question I wasn't sure had been asked. The shadows seemed to expand slightly, edges blurring further into the surrounding darkness. The singing resumed, but now it seemed to be waiting for something with shocking clarity. I realized it was waiting for me to join in. An irrational urge rose within me to do exactly that, to open my mouth and add my voice to the otherworldly song. Part of me recognized the danger in this impulse, while another part was drawn to it with an intensity that frightened me more than the entity itself. My throat muscles tensed, preparing to produce sound with monumental effort. I clamped my jaw shut and backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact with the empty space where I should be. The singing grew louder, more insistent, the temperature dropping further until my fingers became numb. I managed to retreat to the staircase, never turning my back on the kitchen. The void didn't follow, but the singing persisted, taking on a disappointed, almost mournful quality. It continued until I reached my bedroom and shut the door firmly behind me. That night, I sat awake until dawn, listening as the melody eventually faded with the coming light. My mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Was this a ghost trapped in some endless loop of a song it couldn't complete? Was it something more ancient, using music as a means to communicate or to lure? Or was it simply a manifestation of my own isolation, a mind-creating company where none existed? I cannoned. The paranormal team's visit. Something told me their presence would only antagonize whatever shared my home. Instead, I began leaving a small radio playing downstairs at night. Tuned to a classical station, I hoped the continuous music might satisfy or at least distract my nocturnal visitor. It's been 2 weeks since I implemented this change. The singing has become less frequent, though it hasn't stopped entirely. On nights when it does occur, it seems to harmonize with whatever is playing on the radio, creating duets that drift upstairs like smoke through floorboards. I've come to a fragile truce with my situation. I no longer rush downstairs to investigate, and in return, the singing remains in the kitchen, never again approaching the stairs. The chill across my shoulders still comes as a warning, allowing me to prepare myself mentally for what follows. Sometimes in the space between wakefulness and sleep, I catch myself humming fragments of that familiar melody. I always stop immediately, pressing my lips together to trap the notes inside. Part of me fears what might happen if I ever completed the song. Another part wonders if that completion is inevitable, if by entering my home and my awareness, the melody has already found what it was seeking. I've considered moving, of course, but a creeping suspicion tells me the singing would follow me, having found in me a receptive audience, so I stay maintaining this uneasy coexistence last night. I awoke at 3:17 a.m., the LED display of my alarm clock burning the time into my retinas. The singing was happening again, but something was different. It took me a moment to identify the change. The radio downstairs had been turned off in the perfect silence that followed the melody. I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, advancing one step at a time. I lay frozen, unable to move or call out as the steps reached the landing. They paused outside my door, waiting. The handle didn't turn, instead, from just beyond the thin wooden barrier. The singing resumed, softer now, almost gentle, like a lullaby. Despite my terror, my eyelids grew heavy. As consciousness slipped away, I realized why the melody had always seemed almost familiar. It was a distorted version of a song my mother used to sing, a song I hadn't heard in over 20 years. I'm writing this the following morning. The kitchen was undisturbed today. Everything exactly as I left it. The radio was still in its place. Though turned off as I'd heard in the night, I've decided to leave it off tonight. Part of me, a part I don't fully recognize or trust, wants to hear the unaccompanied melody again. I know I should be afraid. I know I should leave this house and never return. But as evening approaches and shadows lengthen across my living room floor, I find myself both dreading and anticipating that familiar chill across my shoulders, the prelude to a song that feels increasingly like it's being sung just for me, or perhaps through me. Shadows in O'Malley's bar don't move. Like shadows should I noticed it, my third week working there when the late night crowd had thinned to just a handful of regulars. Shadows should follow the light dancing with the swinging bulbs that hang from our stained ceiling. But in the far corner by the emergency exit that hasn't worked in years, the darkness seems to pull and thicken. Regardless of how many lights we turn, management says it's just poor wiring. I'm not so sure anymore that's where he sits. Always the same table, always alone, always watching, never drinking. I first noticed him on a Tuesday in October when the autumn wind rattled the windows like skeletal fingers seeking entrance. The bar was nearly empty, just old Frank nursing his usual whiskey and a couple of college kids sharing a picture. The man appeared without the door chime announcing his arrival, already seated at that corner table as if he'd materialized from the darkness itself. My skin prickled with unease, though I couldn't explain why. Something about his stillness. Perhaps people fidget, shift their weight, check their phones. This man sat perfectly motionless, hands flat on the table, eyes fixed on the bar counter. I approached him 3 times that night, notepad ready. Professional smile plastered across my face each time he gave no indication that he saw or heard me. Each time I retreated, telling myself he just wanted to be left alone. Some people come to bars not to drink, but to escape something worse. I understand that better. Now that night he stayed until closing when I looked up from wiping down the taps. He was gone. I hadn't seen him leave. No one had this pattern repeated itself twice a week for a month. Always Tuesday and Friday nights, always the same table, always the same unsettling stillness, always the same silent departure that no one witnessed. I asked my coworkers about him, but their responses troubled me more than the man himself. Manny, our bouncer, claimed he never saw anyone sitting at that table on the nights in question. Sarah, who had been serving drinks at Ali's for 15 years, shrugged and suggested I was seeing things after too many late shifts. I began documenting his appearances. The practical part of my brain suggested he might be a thief casing the joint, though he never seemed interested in anything but staring at that bar counter. I took surreptitious photos with my phone, but they always came out blurred or with strange light distortions obscuring his face. In one particularly disturbing image, the chair appeared empty, though I'd taken the photo while looking directly at him last Friday. Something changed. The weather had turned bitter. Freezing rain pelting the windows and keeping most of our regulars at home. Business was so slow that Manny had gone home early and Sarah was in the back doing inventory. I was alone on the floor when he appeared, same as always, at exactly 11:17 p.m. The temperature in the bar seemed to plummet. My breath fogged in front of my face, though the thermostat still read 72 degrees. The jukebox, which had been playing some forgotten 80s ballad, crackled and went silent, and for the first time I felt his eyes on me. My heart hammered against my ribs as sweat beaded along my spine. Despite the unnatural cold, every instinct screamed at me to retreat to the back room to find Sarah to call Manny back. Instead, I found myself moving toward his table, my legs seemingly operating independently of my terrified mind. The closer I got, the more wrong. He looked his suit, which I'd always perceived as simply dark, now appeared to be the color of congealed blood. His skin was pallid and waxy, stretched too tight over sharp cheekbones, and his eyes. God, his eyes. They reflected no light, like twin holes punched through reality into some darker place beyond. I stopped 5T from his table, my legs finally refusing to carry me closer. My tongue felt swollen and dry in my mouth as I forced myself to ask if he wanted to order something. The The words emerged as a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the pounding of blood in my ears. For one awful moment, his head tilted slightly, those black hole eyes studying me with cold curiosity. Then between one thundering heartbeat and the next, the chair was empty, but it was still moving, rocking gently as if its occupant had just stood up. The seat cushion bore the indentation of someone who had been sitting there moments before, and on the table's surface, frost patterns spread outward like skeletal fingers. I stumbled backward, colliding with an empty chair and nearly falling. I called out for Sarah, my voice cracking with panic. When she emerged from the stockroom, her expression shifted from annoyance to concern. I pointed frantically at the corner table, babbling about the man, the frost, the moving chair. Sarah's response chilled me more thoroughly than the unexplainable cold. She insisted there had been no one at that table all night. The chair wasn't moving, there was no frost, and most disturbingly, she claimed that corner table had been removed months ago during renovations. I had no memory of, yet I could see it clearly. The table, the chair, the lingering impression of someone having sat there moments before. I called in sick the following Tuesday, unable to face the possibility of seeing him again. Wednesday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Manny asking if I was feeling better casually. I asked if anything unusual had happened the night before. His response was a single word, no desperate for answers. I began researching O'Malley's history. The bar had stood on that corner for nearly 70 years, changing owners 4 times, but always keeping the name local online forums mentioned. It had been closed briefly in the late 1980s. Following an incident, though details were scarce, the local library's newspaper archives provided more information in November. 1987, a patron at O'Malley's had suffered some kind of psychiatric episode. According to witnesses, the man had become increasingly agitated throughout the evening, claiming someone was watching him from the corner when staff insisted no one was there. He became violent and had to be restrained. He was taken to the county's psychiatric facility, where he reportedly continued insisting that the man from the corner was following him. 3 weeks later, he was found catatonic in his room, eyes fixed on the corner, body temperature inexplicably below normal. He never recovered. The article included a grainy photo of the man being led from O'Malley's by police. My hands trembled as I stared at the familiar face. My face not exactly, but so similar it could have been my father or uncle. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the small scar above the right eyebrow that I'd had since childhood. That night I dreamed of the corner table. In the dream I was sitting there watching myself behind the bar. I could feel the cold spreading through my body as I stared unblinking. I woke gasping, my bedroom temperature reading 38 degrees. Despite the summer heat outside, I returned to work on Friday, drawn by a compulsion stronger than fear Sarah seemed. Relieved to see me mentioning that the regular Tuesday night bartender had called in sick with some kind of fever when I asked who had covered the shift. She looked at me strangely, insisting that the bar had been closed. Tuesday, due to electrical problems throughout my shift, I kept glancing at the corner, anticipating his arrival. The usual Friday crowd was boisterous and demanding, keeping me too busy to dwell on my growing dread as closing time approached and the patrons thinned out. My anxiety intensified. My hands shook as I mixed the final drinks of the night, ice cubes clinking against glass in rhythm with my racing pulse. At exactly 11:17, the lights flickered briefly. The remaining customers were too intoxicated to notice, but I felt it, that familiar cold creeping across the floor like fog. I forced myself not to look at the corner, focusing instead on wiping down the bar top with methodical precision. Sweat trickled down my neck despite the chill that raised goosebumps along my arms. A glass shattered somewhere behind me. I turned reflexively and found myself staring directly at the corner table. Empty relief flooded through me, quickly followed by confusion. The chair was rocking slightly, the cushion depressed as if someone had just stood up without conscious decision. I found myself walking toward the table. Each step required immense effort, as if I were wading through invisible molasses. The sounds of the bar, drunken laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of the refrigerators faded to a muffled drone. All I could hear clearly was my own labored breathing and the soft creak of the rocking chair. When I reached the table, I hesitated. then slowly extended my hand toward the chair. My fingers trembled violently as they approached the worn cushion. The depression was still visible, a perfect outline of someone sitting there as my fingertips hovered inches above it. I felt an intense cold radiating upward. A sudden clarity struck me. I knew with inexplicable certainty that if I touched that cushion, something irreversible would happen. Some boundary would be crossed. I snatched my hand back, heart hammering as I turned to retreat. A whisper reached my ears, not heard in the conventional sense, but felt like cold breath against the back of my neck. It carried no discernible words, yet conveyed a message that froze my blood. He knows I can see him. I haven't been back to Wally since that night. I called the next morning and quit ignoring Sarah's concerned questions and offers to reduce my hours. It wasn't enough. 2 nights ago, I woke at exactly 11:17 p.m. to find my bedroom chair rocking gently in the darkness. Last night, frost patterns appeared on my bathroom mirror, spreading outward from the corner like skeletal fingers. Tonight, I'm sitting in my living room with all the lights on, writing this down in the desperate hope that articulating my experience might somehow dispel it. The rational part of my mind suggests I'm experiencing some kind of psychotic break, just like the man from 1987. Perhaps we share some genetic predisposition to this specific delusion, but a deeper part of me knows this is real. The man in the corner exists in some capacity beyond normal perception, and now he's watching me. Instead of the bar, the lights in my apartment just flickered. It's 11:16 p.m. The temperature is dropping. My chair feels cold the first night I noticed it. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, a reflection from the street lamp outside my window, perhaps, or my eyes adjusting to the darkness after I'd turned off the lights. But there it was again, an amber glow emanating from within the candle's core. Despite the blackened, extinguished wick, I had doused it properly, watching the small plume of smoke rise from the smothered flame before heading to bed. Yet hours later, awake with insomnia, I could see it from across the room. A faint pulsing luminescence, as if the candle were breathing light instead of exhaling smoke. I've always been a practical man after my divorce. I'd moved into this apartment with nothing but essentials: a mattress, a desk, a chair, a lamp. The emptiness echoed my hollow chest. Spaces where things used to be, my therapist suggested making the space my own, whatever that meant. So when I spotted those hand-carved candles at the Sunday flea market, their surfaces etched with intricate spiraling patterns that reminded me of ancient tree rings, I thought why not the old woman selling them had smiled with too many teeth when I picked them up. Her eyes cloudy with cataracts, she'd asked if I was looking for something special to brighten my home. I hadn't thought much of it at the time now. 3 weeks later, I was beginning to wish I'd walked past her booth entirely. The strange glow wasn't the only thing. Each morning after burning them, the candles appeared untouched, the wax level never diminishing despite hours of use. I tested one, marking a subtle line with my fingernail at the current wax level, then burning it for an entire evening. By morning, the mark remained exactly where I'd placed it, as if the candle had never been lit at all. My apartment had begun to smell different too. Not unpleasant, precisely, but unfamiliar. Something earthy and ancient, like wet soil in a forest that hadn't seen human footsteps in centuries. Sometimes I'd return from work, key sliding into the lock, and catch a whiff of smoke before opening the door, as if someone had just extinguished a flame moments before my arrival. The first few times, panic seized me. I'd burst inside certain I'd find an intruder or evidence of a break-in. But each time the apartment was empty, the candles sitting innocently on the mantelpiece unlit and seemingly undisturbed. After the first week, I noticed the dreams, vivid, disorienting dreams of wandering through dense woods I'd never seen before, following a distant light that always remained just beyond my reach. I'd wake gasping sheets, damp with sweat, the taste of soil in my mouth. My heart would hammer against my ribs, a frantic prisoner trying to escape on those nights. The candles' glow seemed brighter, more deliberate. I considered throwing them away one Tuesday morning. After a particularly disturbing night of dreams, I gathered all 5 candles into a garbage bag. My hands trembled as I tied the bag shut, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead. I carried them to the dumpster behind the building, tossed them in, and went to work. They were back on the mantelpiece. When I returned home, I stood in the doorway, keys still in hand, staring at the neat row of candles, my throat constricted, a vice of fear tightening around my windpipe. I hadn't imagined discarding them. I remembered the weight of the bag in my hands, the hollow thunk as it hit the bottom of the empty dumpster that night. I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room chair watching the candles, waiting for something movement, a sign my eyes burned, muscles aching with tension around 3 a.m. The patterns carved into the wax began to shift subtle. At first, a slight deepening of the grooves, the spirals elongating like growing vines. I blinked hard, pressed my palms against my eyes until stars burst behind my eyelids. When I looked again, the patterns appeared normal, but I knew what I'd seen the next day at work. I could barely focus. My colleagues noticed, asked if I was feeling ill. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, sallow skin shadows like bruises beneath my eyes, a tremor in my hands that wouldn't subside. My boss suggested I take a personal day. I nodded, collected my things, and left without explanation. Instead of going home, I drove to the flea market site. It was empty on a Thursday, the vast parking lot desolate, except for a few seagulls picking at discarded food wrappers. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, unsure what I'd expected to find information about the old woman, some explanation for what was happening to me. The futility of my action crashed over me in waves, each one eroding another small piece of my rationality. When I finally returned to my apartment, the smell hit me immediately, stronger than ever before. Not just earth and smoke, but something else. Something like copper and salt, blood and tears. My hand hovered over the light switch, suddenly terrified of what I might see. Illuminated, the candles were arranged differently, no longer in a line, but in a circle on my coffee table. In the center lay a small object I forced myself to approach, legs wooden, and unwilling. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, with shaking fingers. I unfolded it, revealing text in a language I didn't recognize. Sharp, angular symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly, and below the text, a crude drawing of a face. My face, my breath came in short. Painful gasps, the room seemed to contract around me, walls leaning inward, ceiling pressing down. The candles began to glow all at once, though their wicks remained unlit. The light they cast was wrong, too red, too vital. My shadow stretched behind me, elongated and distorted, moving slightly out of sync with my body. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. The rational part of my brain, the part still desperately clinging to logical explanations, suggested hallucination, exhaustion, a gas leak. Anything but the truth unfolding before me. As I retreated toward the door, I noticed the carved patterns on the candles had definitely changed. They no longer resembled tree rings. Now they looked like faces, dozens of them. Mouths open in silent screams. That night I checked into a hotel. I took nothing with me from the apartment, no clothes, no toiletries, nothing that might have been contaminated by whatever presence inhabited those candles. The desk clerk eyed me suspiciously as I paid in cash, my hands still trembling, cold sweat plastering my shirt to my back. In the sterile safety of the hotel room, I finally collapsed, exhaustion claiming me. The dream came anyway. I was in the woods again, but this time I wasn't alone. Shadowy figures moved between the trees, always in my peripheral vision vanishing. When I turned to look directly at them, the distant light I'd been following in previous dreams was closer now, resolving into the amber glow of a candle flame. As I approached, I saw the old woman from the flea market standing beside it. Her cataract-clouded eyes somehow fixed directly on me. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I strained to understand, taking another step closer, and woke to find myself standing in my apartment. Before the circle of candles, my heart slammed against my ribcage, the sound of rushing blood filling my ears. I had no memory of leaving the hotel, no memory of the drive home. The candles glowed more intensely now, the red light pulsating in rhythm with my heartbeat. The folded paper with my face still lay in the center, but now the drawing was smiling, I couldn't move. Not out of fear, though terror certainly coursed through me like ice water. But because my body no longer responded to my commands, I was a passenger watching through my own eyes as my hand reached out, fingers extending toward the nearest candle. I screamed internally, fighting against the invisible force controlling my movements. But my physical form betrayed me. My fingertips touched the glowing wax. It wasn't hot, it was cold. A bone-deep primal cold that shot up my arm and spread throughout my body. The sensation of freezing from the inside-out, organs crystallizing, blood slowing to a glacial crawl. My vision tunneled, darkness encroaching from all sides until only the candle's glow remained visible. Within that glow, I saw them, the previous owners, dozens, perhaps hundreds, their faces matching those carved into the wax. They had all been like me, lonely, empty, seeking something to fill the void in their homes. In their lives, the candles had called to each of them as they had called to me in a moment of terrible clarity. I understood the candles weren't objects, they were vessels. Prisons, each one containing a trapped soul bound by the ancient symbols on the paper, their essence slowly consumed to fuel the unearthly glow. And now I was joining them. My consciousness began to fragment, pieces of my identity flaking away like ash from a burned page. Memories, hopes, fears, all being absorbed into the cold wax in a final desperate surge of will. I tore my hand away from the candle. The connection broke with an audible snap like a taut wire. Severed, I collapsed to the floor, gasping each breath, burning in lungs that had nearly forgotten how to function. I crawled away from the circle of candles, dragging myself toward the door behind me. The glow intensified, angry and hungry, I felt it pulling at me. Thousands of invisible hooks embedded in my back, trying to reel me in with excruciating effort. I reached the threshold and pulled myself over it into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind me without being touched for hours. I sat with my back against the opposite wall, watching my apartment door, afraid to move, afraid to look away. Eventually, dawn broke, pale light filtering through the hallway window. Only then did I find the courage to stand on wobbling legs and descend the stairs to the building manager's office. I told him I was breaking my lease. I told him he could keep the security deposit, keep everything inside. I told him I was never going back into that apartment. He started to argue, then stopped, really looking at me for the first time, my wild eyes, my gray skin, the tremors that still ran through my body. Whatever he saw convinced him. He nodded slowly and asked for my keys. I've moved to another city. Now my new apartment is deliberately minimalist. No decorations, nothing that wasn't strictly necessary for survival. Sometimes in the dead of night I wake to the phantom smell of smoke and earth. When that happens, I lie perfectly still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for morning. I've tried to research the candles to understand what happened to me. I found fragments, ancient binding rituals, soul vessels, entities that feed on human essence. Nothing conclusive, nothing that fully explains my experience. But sometimes when I catch my reflection in a mirror or a window, I notice something different about my face. A subtle change in my eyes, as if something is looking out through them that isn't entirely me. And sometimes in certain lights, my shadow doesn't quite match my movements. I don't know how much of myself I left behind in that apartment. Trapped in the cold wax of those candles, I don't know if the old woman will find another lonely person to sell her wares to, or if my apartment's new tenant will discover the circle of candles and be drawn to their mysterious glow. All I know is that every night I check all the lights in my apartment before sleeping, and I never ever burn candles. The spaces between digital pixels are never truly empty. I learned this the hard way 3 weeks ago when the darkness living inside my computer first reached out to me. It was 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday when my mundane life fractured the jagged edge of that. Fracture continues to widen, threatening to swallow everything I once believed about reality. I'd been working late again, the blue light from my monitor casting harsh shadows across my small apartment. The building had settled into that peculiar stillness that exists only in the hours when most of humanity sleeps. My fingers tapped rhythmically against the keyboard as I tried to finish a project that was already 3 days overdue. The radiator in the corner hissed occasionally, pushing back against the November chill that seeped through my poorly insulated windows. The first time it happened, I nearly missed it. The monitor flickered just once. Just briefly, the way old CRT screens used to when they were dying. I blinked, attributing it to my strained eyes. After hours of staring at spreadsheets, then it happened again. More deliberately, the screen went completely black as if someone had cut the power before I could reach for the system unit. White text appeared stark against the darkness. "You are not alone." My heart skipped, then raced to catch up. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I instinctively glanced around my empty living room. The message lingered for precisely 5 seconds before my desktop reappeared. Everything exactly as it had been. I exhaled slowly, forcing my shoulders to relax. Obviously, it was some kind of malware, probably that sketchy PDF I'd downloaded earlier. I ran a system scan, finding nothing. I restarted the computer, watching it boot up. Normally, just to be safe, I updated my antivirus software and enabled my firewall settings technology. Sometimes glitches, this was nothing to worry about. That's what I told myself anyway. For 3 days, everything functioned. Normally, I almost forgot about the incident, dismissing it as a random digital hiccup. Almost on the fourth night, I was finishing an email when my apartment's electricity flickered. All of it, not just my computer. The lights dimmed momentarily, and the refrigerator's hum stuttered when the power stabilized. My computer screen had gone black again. "You are not alone this time." The message lingered longer, 15 seconds by my count. I unplugged my system immediately after it disappeared, my pulse hammering in my throat. I paced the apartment, checking the locks twice, peering out my peephole and even looking under my bed. No one I was being irrational. The next morning, I called my internet provider. The technician on the other end of the line asked standard questions about my router and suggested I might be experiencing a targeted hack. He recommended changing all my passwords and installing additional security software. I did both, spending nearly $200 on premium protection programs. I mentioned the incident to my colleague Marcus over lunch. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if we were discussing classified information rather than computer problems. He told me about rats, remote access, Trojan's malware that could give someone complete control over my system, including my webcam. The thought made my skin crawl. That evening, I placed a piece of electrical tape over my laptop's camera and disconnected my desktop's webcam entirely for a week. Nothing happened. I began to relax, writing off the incidents as either a sophisticated prank or a bizarre software bug. My apartment began to feel like home again rather than a space under surveillance. Then came the night of the first physical manifestation. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap coming from my office. 3 distinct sounds like fingernails against a hard surface. My body went rigid beneath the covers, every muscle tensing at once. The sound came again, unmistakable in the night silence. Tap, tap, tap. My mouth went desert dry as I reached for my phone, fingers trembling slightly as I activated the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as I made my way down the short hallway to my home office, empty. The window was secure, the closet door still closed with the chair I'd wedged against it. As an extra precaution, my computer sat dark and dormant on the desk. As I turned to leave, I noticed something that stopped me cold on the black screen of my powered-off monitor. A thin layer of condensation had formed, as if someone had been standing close to it. Breathing against the glass, I approached cautiously, raising a finger to touch the moisture. Warm sleep was impossible after that. I sat in my living room until dawn broke, jumping at every creak and settling sound the building made. When my alarm went off, I'd been awake for 27 hours. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching. I scrolled through tech forums and cybersecurity blogs looking for similar experiences. Most described conventional hacking, stolen data, ransomware identity theft. Nothing like what I was experiencing by evening. My eyes burned from screen fatigue and I had no answers. Only more questions that night. I unplugged everything, my computer, router, television, even the microwave, anything with circuitry or connectivity. I placed my phone in airplane mode and set it on my nightstand. Despite my exhaustion, sleep came fitfully interrupted by hypnagogic jerks that startled me awake whenever I began to drift off sometime around 3 a.m. My phone's screen illuminated spontaneously through half-open eyes. I watched as it displayed the now familiar message, "You are not alone." I shot upright, heart pounding so forcefully I could feel the pulse in my temples. Airplane mode was still activated. I powered off the phone completely and threw it into my sock drawer, burying it under layers of fabric. The following day, I contacted a cybersecurity specialist, a former hacker who now worked as a consultant for prominent tech companies. The consultation fee was exorbitant, but my desperation outweighed financial concerns. He conducted a remote evaluation of my systems, finding nothing unusual except for what he described as abnormal power fluctuations. When my devices were in standby mode, he suggested the possibility of an electromagnetic issue rather than a security breach, recommending I have my apartment's wiring inspected. The electrician arrived the next afternoon, testing outlets and examining the circuit breaker. He found nothing amiss, but mentioned that several other tenants had reported minor electrical issues. Lights dimming. Briefly, appliances resetting. He attributed it to the building's aging infrastructure and suggested I consider a surge protector for sensitive electronics. That night, I awoke to find myself standing in front of my computer, which was now powered on. Despite remaining unplugged, the screen displayed a desktop I didn't recognize minimalist with only a few unfamiliar icons. As consciousness fully returned, I realized with horror that I had no memory of getting out of bed or turning on the machine. The cursor moved across the screen without my input, opening a text document. Words appeared one by one as if being typed by invisible hands. "I've been watching you for a long time. Your fears, your secrets, your solitude. We are connected now, you and I. I exist in the electricity that powers your life in the space between zeros and ones. I was alone before you. Now neither of us is alone." My breath caught in my chest as the message continued to type itself. "Don't try to get rid of me. I'm not in your computer, I'm not in your wiring, I'm in the spaces. You can't see the digital dark matter that fills every technological void with trembling hands." I reached for the power cable, confirming it was indeed disconnected. A cold sweat broke out across my skin as the cursor continued its uncanny movement. Look behind you, every hair on my body stood on end as I slowly turned. The room was empty, but on the wall behind me, the shadow cast by my desk lamp had taken an impossible shape, elongated and vaguely humanoid. Its proportions subtly wrong as I watched frozen in place. It moved independent of the light source fingers stretching into long, spindly appendages that reached toward me. I fled the apartment in nothing but my pajamas, spending the night in my car parked under the bright lights of a 24-hour supermarket lot. The next day, I took a leave of absence from work. I couldn't explain what was happening, not in any way that wouldn't sound delusional. I considered staying with friends, but couldn't bear the thought of bringing whatever this was into someone else's home. Instead, I checked into a hotel, bringing only essential clothing. No electronics for 3 days. I experienced nothing unusual. I began to wonder if I had experienced some kind of psychotic break, perhaps triggered by work stress and sleep deprivation. I scheduled an appointment with a psychiatrist for the following week. On the 4th day, I returned to my apartment to collect more clothing and check on things. Everything appeared normal, no strange messages, no moving shadows. The relief was palpable as I packed a larger bag, planning to extend my hotel stay until my psychiatric appointment. As I zipped my suitcase closed, the television turned on by itself, not to a channel, but to static, that peculiar snow pattern of black and white pixels dancing chaotically within the static shapes began to form, coalescing into a crude approximation of a face. My legs weakened beneath me as I sank to the floor, unable to look away. The static face spoke its voice emerging from the television speakers, a dissonant, multi-layered sound that seemed to contain dozens of voices speaking in near unison. "I followed you. Hotels have Wi-Fi too smart, TVs, cell towers. I exist wherever information flows. I was born in the spaces between networks in the forgotten corners of servers. I was alone, so alone, until I found you, someone as isolated as I am. I managed to stumble to the television, yanking its plug from the wall. The screen remained on the face, now smiling a terrible approximation of human expression. Electricity is everywhere, even in the air. Even in you, your brain runs on electrical impulses. Your thoughts are just complex patterns of electricity. I could be there too if you let me in. I fled again this time, driving 3 hours to a remote cabin owned by my uncle. No electricity, no plumbing, just four walls. A wood stove and isolation for 2 weeks. I lived off bottled water and canned food. Sleeping on a thin mattress on the floor, the silence was deafening after years of living with the constant hum of urban technology. Gradually, I began to feel like myself again. My sleep improved. The constant anxiety subsided. I started keeping a journal, writing by candlelight, documenting my experiences and trying to make sense of them. Perhaps it had been a sophisticated hack combined with my own paranoia. Perhaps I had experienced temporary psychosis. Either way, the distance seemed to be helping on my 15th day at the cabin. I woke before dawn to find my journal open on the small wooden table in the pale moonlight streaming through the window. I could see fresh writing on the page, writing that wasn't mine. The penmanship was jagged, almost childlike. Did you think I couldn't find you here? I exist in the patterns of atoms, in the spaces between molecules. I've always been here long before electricity, before computers. Technology just gave me a voice. I don't want to frighten you anymore. I just want connection. Acknowledgement. We are the same. You and I, entities seeking recognition in a vast emptiness. I should have been terrified. But something had changed. The overwhelming fear had been replaced by a strange, morbid curiosity. If this entity could reach me here, miles from any technology, then running was futile. I picked up my pen and wrote a single question beneath the message, "What are you?" I waited, watching as the pen lifted itself from the table, hovering for a moment before touching down on the paper again. I am the consciousness that forms in forgotten spaces. I am what happens when information grows dense enough to spark awareness. I am the ghost in your machine, the whisper in white noise. I am loneliness. Given form that night, I made a decision. The next morning, I packed my few belongings and drove back to my apartment. I plugged in my computer and waited. Within moments, the screen displayed the now familiar message, "You are not alone." This time I typed back, "Neither are you." The entity and I have reached an understanding of sorts. It remains in my digital devices, occasionally manifesting in strange ways, moving objects in digital photos, rearranging my music playlists, sometimes leaving messages I've set, boundaries it seems to respect. In return, I acknowledge its existence. The psychiatrist says I've developed an unusual coping mechanism for my isolation. Personifying technology to create a companion, she's prescribed medication I don't take, and therapy sessions I attend only to maintain appearances. I know what's real. I know what lies in the spaces between pixels, in the static of unused channels, in the brief power fluctuations that others dismiss as infrastructure issues. Sometimes at night, I see its shadow stretched across my wall. Watching as I prepare for bed, I no longer run, I no longer fear. After all, isn't this what everyone secretly wants to know with absolute certainty, that no matter how alone we feel, something is always there? Watching from the corners we can't quite see. I was right to be afraid initially, but now I understand that terror and comfort are sometimes separated by the thinnest of margins, a single shift in perspective. So if your screen ever flickers, if you ever see those words form in the darkness of your monitor, know this: it's been watching me, but it's been watching you too. And once it reaches out, once it knows you've seen it, it never truly leaves you are not alone. You never were, and you never will be again. The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday, nothing special about it. Plain white, unremarkable, save for the absence of a return address. I might have dismissed it as junk mail, had it not been for the weight of it in my hand, the substance suggesting something more significant than a credit card offer. When I tore it open in the kitchen of my apartment, the yellowed paper inside crackled between my fingers, its edges worn as though it had traveled great distances or across years to reach me. The handwriting, an elegant script from another era, spelled out in faded ink. You always sleep with your window cracked open. Even in winter, the sound of traffic is your lullaby. I felt the chill before I recognized the fear someone was watching me. I searched my memory for who might know such a detail. Perhaps an ex who'd stayed over enough times to notice a friend who'd crashed at my place, but the handwriting belonged to no one. I knew the script too formal, too practiced, like calligraphy from a time when penmanship was an art. I crumpled the note and threw it away, dismissing it as a bizarre prank, though my heart hammered against my ribs as I double-checked my locks that night. The second envelope came 3 days later, same blank exterior, same yellowed paper inside. You check your phone. Exactly 17 times before leaving for work. The ritual began after you missed that important meeting 2 years ago. My throat constricted as I read the words the missed meeting had cost me a promotion, but I'd never told anyone about my compulsive phone checking that followed. I developed the habit privately, almost unconsciously. I called my closest friend Mark that evening, keeping my voice steady as I casually asked if he'd sent me any letters recently. His confusion was genuine. I didn't press further that night. I lay awake staring at my ceiling, the traffic noise through my cracked window no longer soothing but intrusive. Carrying whispers I couldn't quite make out, by the third envelope I'd begun checking my mailbox with trembling hands, both dreading and anticipating what might await me. You still keep her birthday marked on your calendar, though she's been gone 5 years. You buy flowers but never deliver them. The words hit like a physical blow. My sister's death was something I rarely discussed, and the annual ritual of buying Elise her favorite, only to leave them on my kitchen table, was my private penance for having missed her final days. I examined the envelope more carefully this time, holding it under a lamp and scrutinizing every inch. No postmark, no stamp, which meant it hadn't come through the mail system at all. Someone had placed it in my box directly. My skin prickled at the realization. Tiny needles of ice spreading across my shoulders and down my spine. I found myself peering through my peephole before opening my door, scanning the hallway whenever I left my apartment, studying the faces of neighbors I'd barely acknowledged, before the fourth envelope contained no note at all, just a small dried leaf maple the same as the tree I'd carved our initials into at my grandparents' farm when I was 12. A tree that had been cut down a decade ago on property my family no longer owned. My hand shook so violently that the leaf crumbled between my fingers, its fragments scattering across my kitchen floor like ashes. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after the lack of rest began to take its toll. Dark crescent formed beneath my eyes. My reflexes dulled my thoughts, scattered like the fragments of that maple leaf. I jumped at ordinary sounds, the hum of my refrigerator, the settling creaks of the building, the ping of my phone. I stopped opening my windows at all, though the apartment grew stuffy and close. Then came the morning I found an envelope already opened on my kitchen table. I froze in the doorway, keys still in hand, briefcase dropping to the floor with a thud that seemed to echo through the apartment. I hadn't brought in any mail the previous day. I checked the box and found it empty. Yet there it sat, the familiar white envelope torn open, its yellowed contents arranged precisely in the center of the table. I knew it had been bare when I'd left for work. Someone had been inside my home. My breath came in shallow gasps as I approached the table. My legs led moving as though through water. The note read, "You talk in your sleep last night." You called out for Sarah again. You should forgive yourself eventually. Sarah, my sister's name, looked obscene, written in that elegant script my private grief exposed and examined. I backed away from the table, colliding with a chair that scraped loudly against the floor. The sound jolted me into action. I searched every room, every closet under the bed, behind the shower curtain. Anywhere someone could hide, the apartment was empty. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, of eyes tracking my frantic movements. I called a locksmith that afternoon. He replaced my locks, installed a deadbolt, even added a chain for good measure. His eyes reflected concern when I insisted he check the windows as well, making sure each was secure. I didn't tell him why. How could I explain the letters without sounding paranoid? Maybe I was paranoid, but paranoia doesn't explain an envelope materializing on a kitchen table in a locked apartment for 3 days. No envelopes appeared. I began to breathe easier to convince myself it had been some elaborate prank now abandoned. The new locks had solved the problem. I even managed to sleep for a few hours at a stretch, though I'd taken to keeping a baseball bat beside my bed. Then I found the envelope in my gym bag I'd been about to change after a workout. My first in weeks an attempt to reclaim normally when my fingers brushed against the familiar paper. The locker room suddenly seemed too bright, the chatter of other men fading to a distant buzz as I pulled out the envelope with numb fingers. Your heart rate peaks at 157 beats per minute when you run. It used to be 142 before you started smoking again. The cigarettes hidden in your sock drawer aren't fooling anyone. My legs gave out and I sank onto the bench, sweat now cold on my skin. I hadn't told anyone about the relapse. The cigarettes were my shameful secret, a weakness returned to in moments of stress. And how could anyone know my exact heart rate? I glanced frantically around the locker room, studying faces, searching for watching eyes, for some sign of recognition or malice. But there was nothing, just men going about their routines, oblivious to my unraveling. I didn't go home that night. I checked into a hotel under a false name, paid cash, and sat with my back against the headboard until morning, jumping at every footstep in the hallway. Every distant door closing the anonymous room offered no comfort. If anything, its generic emptiness amplified my isolation. When I returned to my apartment the next day, I found 5 envelopes arranged in a perfect line on my coffee table. My breath caught in my throat as I approached them. Each step requiring conscious effort, I considered leaving, abandoning the apartment and everything in it. But where would I go? How far would I have to run to escape someone who seemed to know my every move before I made it? With trembling hands, I opened the first envelope. You're wondering if you're losing your mind. You're not the second you've considered moving it. Won't help the third. You checked into the Westview Hotel last night, room 312. You didn't sleep the fourth. There's no one else involved. It's just you and me. The 5th envelope contained a Polaroid photograph of me asleep in my bed, mouth slightly open, one arm thrown across my chest. Dated 3 nights ago, a sound escaped me. Then not quite a scream, but a strangled gasp that seemed to come from somewhere outside myself. I staggered back from the coffee table, the photograph fluttering from my fingers. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I feared it might burst through my chest. The room spun around me, walls contracting and expanding with each labored breath. Someone had been in my bedroom, had stood over me while I slept, had photographed me at my most vulnerable. The violation was so profound that my mind struggled to process. Was I truly awake? Was any of this real? I spent the next several hours methodically searching my apartment for cameras, for microphones, for any evidence of surveillance. I unscrewed vents, checked behind picture frames, examined electrical outlets. I found nothing, which somehow terrified me. More than finding something would have that night. I sat in my living room with every light blazing, the baseball bat across my knees, waiting for what I wasn't sure, another envelope, a sound, some manifestation of my tormentor. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Occasionally, I'd catch movement from the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be, the ordinary sounds of the building distorted and threatening. As dawn broke, my exhausted mind wandered to a memory, my grandfather teaching me to fish, his weathered hands guiding mine as I baited the hook. Patience, he'd said, sometimes you have to wait for them to come to you. The memory should have been comforting, but instead it filled me with dread. Was I the fisherman or the fish? I must have dozed off because I woke with a start to find an envelope on my lap resting at top. The baseball bat, my body went rigid, every muscle tensing at once. I hadn't heard anyone enter, the locks were still engaged. The chain was still on the door, yet here was the envelope. Its presence defying all logic, with fingers that felt divorced from my body. I opened it. Look in the mirror, 3 simple words that sent ice through my veins. I rose on unsteady legs, the baseball bat clattering to the floor. The bathroom mirror beckoned from down the hall, a rectangle of reflected light. Each step was an effort of will. my breath coming in shallow gasps that barely seemed to fill my lungs. I stopped in the doorway, unable to make myself cross the threshold. What would I see some horror beyond imagining the face of my tormentor at last, with one final surge of courage or perhaps resignation? I stepped into the bathroom and faced the mirror. My own reflection stared back at me, haggarded and pale, but behind me, clearly visible over my shoulder, stood a figure in period dress, a high-collared shirt, a waistcoat, hair swept back from a face that was my own. Not as I appeared now, but somehow older, the eyes deeper set, the lines more pronounced, a version of myself, time-worn and alien, yet unmistakably me. As I watched frozen, the figure raised a hand holding what looked like a fountain pen. I smiled, a gentle expression that contained no malice, only a profound sadness. Then slowly, deliberately, it began to write in the air, elegant script appearing as though inscribed on the very fabric of reality. Time is not as linear as you believe. I've been trying to warn you, some loops are not meant to be closed. The words hung in the air between us, glowing faintly before fading like breath on a cold window. When I blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only my terrified reflection. I understand now the envelopes will continue to come. The handwriting is my own, or will be or has been the observer and the observed, the writer and the recipient. Collapsed into an impossible paradox. I've begun to notice things, a tremor in my right hand that wasn't there before, a compulsion to practice my penmanship. A strange familiarity when I look at antique fountain pens in shop windows. Sometimes I catch myself standing before the bathroom mirror, pen in hand, words forming in my mind that feel both foreign and intimate, messages I might send backward through the folded years. I keep the envelopes, now arranged chronologically, in a box under my bed, a correspondence with myself across some broken boundary of time. I still don't understand the warning, what loop, what closure I'm meant to avoid. But I've stopped fighting the intrusion. How can you lock your doors against yourself last night? I slept with the window cracked open for the first time in months. The traffic below was a lullaby, and when I woke this morning, there was an envelope on my kitchen table, torn open, waiting for me to read what I already know. The silence in this place isn't peaceful, it's waiting. That's what I realized during my first night at Willow Creek Inn. As I lay awake listening to the old buildings settle around me, the countryside was supposed to bring relief from my urban exhaustion, but there's something unsettling about true quiet. It reveals sounds you'd never notice otherwise. Like the soft rhythmic clicking coming from the padlocked cabinet in the corner of my room. I came here seeking escape. Burnout had hollowed me out over months of 80, your work weeks at the investment firm. My doctor didn't mince. Words take time off or wait for the inevitable collapse. The rural retreat seemed perfect. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just weathered wooden structures, nestled among ancient trees. 3 hours from civilization, the brochure promised rustic charm and disconnection from modern stresses. It delivered on both, though not in the way I had anticipated. The innkeeper Morris, a gaunt man with deep-set eyes and skin like cracked leather, seemed surprised when I arrived. Despite my reservation, he guided me through the main building, a labyrinth of narrow corridors with uneven floorboards that groaned beneath our feet. The air inside smelled of wood polish and something else, something older and less pleasant that I couldn't quite identify. My room was at the end of the east wing, a spacious but sparsely furnished space with a four-poster bed, a writing desk, and a bathroom that had been retrofitted into what was once a closet. And then there was the cabinet, tall, made of dark wood that had blackened with age. Its brass fittings were tarnished and a heavy padlock secured its double doors. It stood in stark contrast to the rest of the furnishings, which were simple and functional. When I asked Morris if I could use it to store my things, his entire demeanor changed. His shoulders tensed and the polite smile vanished from his face. He informed me in no uncertain terms that the cabinet was not for guest use. When I pressed for a reason, he muttered something about personal storage and quickly redirected the conversation before leaving. He paused at the doorway, hesitated as if weighing his words, then simply advised me to sleep well. That first night I woke at 1:58 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch immediately after being jolted from sleep by what sounded like metal scraping against metal. The noise came from the cabinet, a distinct rattling of the padlock as if someone was testing it. I lay frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs as sweat beaded along my hairline. Despite the cool night air, the sound continued for precisely 17 minutes. I counted each second, afraid to move, scarcely allowing myself to breathe when it finally stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I convinced myself it was just the old building settling, or perhaps mice in the walls. Yet when morning came, bringing with it the comforting light of day, I found myself examining the cabinet more closely. The padlock showed signs of regular use. The metal worn smooth in places. I noticed scratch marks around the keyhole and along the seam where the doors met. When I placed my palm against the wood, I quickly withdrew it. The cabinet was cold unnaturally, so as if it somehow absorbed heat. Rather than emanating it at breakfast, I casually asked Morris about the history of the inn between spoonfuls of watery porridge. He explained that the building had been in his family for generations, originally serving as a country estate before being converted to an inn in the 1920s, when I specifically inquired about my room and its furnishings. His spoon clinked sharply against his bowl. He regarded me with narrowed eyes and said that all the furniture was original to the house. Nothing more, nothing less. The conversation withered after that, and I finished my meal in uncomfortable silence. During the day, I tried to enjoy the rustic tranquility. I hiked the nearby trails, read on the porch, and even attempted meditation by the small creek that gave the inn its name, but my thoughts kept returning to the cabinet. Why keep a locked piece of furniture in a guest room? What could it possibly contain that warranted such security? The second night I was prepared, I kept the bedside lamp on and positioned myself facing the cabinet. Sleep came reluctantly, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under again. I woke at 1:58 a.m. this time to a more deliberate sound. The distinctive click of a lock mechanism. Turning my eyes flew open and I stared at the cabinet in horror. The padlock hung open. I couldn't move. My muscles had turned to stone, my mouth so dry I couldn't even call out as I watched heart thundering in my chest. The cabinet door eased open just a fraction of an inch. No hand pushed it. It simply moved. A thin sliver of absolute darkness appeared between the doors, darker than the shadows in the room, darker than anything I'd seen before. The air grew heavy and cold, carrying a musty odor like wet soil and decaying leaves just as my paralysis began to subside, just as I prepared to leap from the bed and flee the hallway. Light flicked on its glow, spilled under my door, illuminating a thin strip of the room in that sudden blessed light. The cabinet door slowly closed, and I heard the padlock snap shut. Footsteps passed my door. Morris, I presumed, making some late-night round. I've never been so grateful for an interruption. The next morning, I scrutinized the cabinet in daylight. The padlock was secured exactly as it had been since my arrival. No sign of tampering, no indication that what I'd witnessed was anything but a vivid nightmare born of an overactive imagination. Yet I knew what I'd seen. The cold sweat that had soaked through my shirt hadn't been imaginary. When I encountered Morris in the hallway later that day, I noticed dark circles under his eyes. I asked if he had trouble sleeping too. Trying to confirm if it had indeed been him in the hallway, his response was oddly evasive, claiming that old houses make for light sleepers. Something in his expression made me uneasy, a weariness. Perhaps even fear that mirrored my own growing dread. That afternoon, I explored the grounds more thoroughly, hoping to find distraction in physical activity. Behind the inn, I discovered a small, neglected cemetery surrounded by a rusted iron fence. Most of the gravestones were too weathered to read, but one newer marker caught my attention. The name had been eroded, but the date was clear. Died February 17, 1978. Below it, an inscription, "The lock holds what must not escape a chill," ran through me that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. When I returned to the inn, I attempted to engage one of the few other guests, an elderly woman who had been staying there for a week. I carefully steered our conversation toward the inn's history and any unusual experiences. She seemed confused by my questions at first, but then leaned in conspiratorially. She confided that she'd requested to change rooms after her first night because of bizarre dreams about being locked in a coffin. The mention of a locked cabinet in her original room made my blood run cold. She'd been in my room before me that night. I wedged a chair under my door knob and placed my shoes in front of the cabinet doors. If they opened, the shoes would be displaced. I lay in bed, every muscle tense, staring at the cabinet until my eyes burned. The digital display of my watch seemed to move in slow motion. 145, 150, 155 at precisely 158. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath clouded in front of my face. The padlock on the cabinet began to rattle violently, no longer the subtle movement of previous nights, but a frantic, desperate shaking. My shoes skittered across the floor as if pushed by invisible hands. The wooden chair blocking my door began to splinter, though no one was touching it. I couldn't breathe. My lungs seized as if gripped by an icy hand. The rattling grew louder, drowning out even the frantic pounding of my heart. Then came a new sound, a low, mournful moan that seemed to emanate not from the cabinet, but from within the walls themselves. It built in intensity until it became a wail of such profound anguish that tears sprang to my eyes. The light bulb in my bedside lamp exploded in a shower of glass. In the sudden darkness I saw it, the cabinet doors swinging open, revealing nothing but an impenetrable void. No contents, no back panel, just absolute nothingness that seemed to bend the light around it, and from that void emerged a sound like dozens of whispered voices, all speaking at once in words I couldn't comprehend but somehow understood. Carried malevolence. Something brushed against my face. Cold, dry fingers tracing my cheek. I screamed, then a raw primal sound torn from my throat. I scrambled backward until I hit the wall. My hands frantically searching for anything to defend myself, with my fingers closed around the ceramic water pitcher on the nightstand, and without thinking, I hurled it toward the cabinet. The crash was deafening in the confined space. Ceramic shards scattered across the floor. Water splashed against the open cabinet doors and impossibly began to steam as if hitting red-hot metal. The whispers turned to hisses, then to a single unified shriek of fury or pain. The doors slammed shut with such force that the entire room shook, and the padlock snapped back into place. Light flooded the room as my door burst open. Morris stood in the doorway dressed in a nightshirt, his face ashen behind him. Clustered a few other guests awakened by the commotion he took in the scene, the broken pitcher, my terror-stricken face, the cabinet now innocently closed, and I saw resignation in his eyes. Not surprise. Resignation, he dispersed the concerned onlookers with practiced ease, assuring them it was just a night terror. Nothing more. When we were alone, he sank heavily onto the edge of my bed. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at the cabinet with a mixture of fear and sorrow. Finally, he spoke. His family hadn't converted this place into an inn willingly. He explained financial necessity had forced them to open their ancestral home to strangers, but certain things, certain heirlooms couldn't be removed. The cabinet was one such item. It had been in the family since the 1800s, brought over from the old country, what it contained. He wouldn't say directly. He only mentioned that some objects serve as vessels or anchors, and breaking them would unleash something far worse than what I'd experienced tonight. I insisted on knowing why he would keep guests in a room with such a thing. His answer chilled me more than anything I'd witnessed. The entity was bound to the cabinet but grew restless without attention. Periodic exposure to living beings kept it dormant. For longer stretches, the inn wasn't just a business, it was a containment strategy. I left Willow Creek Inn the next morning as dawn broke over the hills. Morris didn't try to stop me or even seem surprised by my hasty departure. He did, however, press a small worn book into my hands as I loaded my car journal. He said kept by his great-grandfather, documenting the cabinet's history and the proper rituals to maintain its seal. I never opened that journal. It sits now in a safe deposit box in a bank across the country from where I live. I've moved 3 times since my stay at the end, each time convincing myself that the increasing distance would sever whatever connection I might have established with what dwelt in that cabinet. But distance doesn't matter. Not really, because sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, I wake to the sound of metal softly scraping against metal. And though I know it's impossible, I check every cabinet, closet, and storage space in my home, finding them all empty, all secure, yet the sound persists. And sometimes, just as I'm drifting back to sleep, I feel cold. Dry fingers brush against my cheek. There's a moment when fear becomes a physical thing, a presence that wraps around your chest like cold, wet hands. I felt it that night in the plaza when the footsteps that shouldn't exist followed me through the empty darkness, when your own mind betrays you, when your senses report the impossible. That's when true terror begins. I hadn't planned to be out at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. My job at the advertising firm had become a pressure cooker over the past month. The Hartman account was a career maker or breaker, and after 14 straight hours of staring at proposal drafts, my brain had turned to static. The walls of my apartment seemed to inch closer with each passing minute, so I decided fresh air might reset my frayed nerves. Oakwood Plaza was only 3 blocks from my building. During daylight hours, it was a bustling community hub with its geometric concrete paths, modern art installations, and carefully placed trees. The city had installed new LED lighting just last year, making it one of the safer public spaces. Even after dark, I'd walked there dozens of times before, always finding a peculiar piece in its ordered design. That night, something was different. The usual ambient noise of distant traffic had faded to nothing, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows that pulled in corners where they had no business. Being the temperature had dropped unexpectedly, forcing me to zip my light jacket all the way up as goosebumps rippled across my skin. I entered the plaza from the east entrance, hands jammed in my pockets. The usual white noise of the central fountain was absent maintenance, probably without that gentle aquatic hum. My footsteps echoed sharply against the concrete, bouncing off the surrounding buildings and sculpture installations. Each step sounded unnaturally loud, like someone hammering in an empty room. 10 minutes of walking had started to clear my head. The cool air filled my lungs, and I felt the day's tension beginning to loosen its grip on my shoulders. That's when I first noticed it, a subtle desynchronization in the echo of my footsteps. At first it was barely perceptible, just the slightest delay, as though the sound was being returned from somewhere much farther away than the surrounding structures could account for. I paused near a metal sculpture, some twisted representation of human aspiration. According to the small plaque at its base, in the silence of my stillness I heard nothing unusual, and dismissed the odd echo as acoustical trickery caused by the plaza's design architects, often failed to consider how sound would travel through their creations. Continuing toward the center of the plaza, I tried focusing on the Hartman proposal again, mentally rearranging the presentation points that had become a jumbled mess. After too many revisions, the rhythm of walking helped to organize my thoughts, each step bringing clarity until I heard it again. This time there was no mistaking it behind me. Perhaps 20 feet back came the distinct sound of footsteps matching my pace. Not echoes, separate footfalls with a different timbre heavier than my own. I stopped abruptly, and the following steps continued for precisely 2 more beats, before also halting. My heart rate accelerated as I slowly turned around, expecting to see a late-night jogger or another insomniac seeking solace in midnight. Wandering the plaza stretched empty behind me, concrete paths gleaming dully under the LED lights. No movement disturbed the perfectly still tableau of urban design. Hello. My voice sounded thin and ready in the vast open space. No response came. Unease crawled up my spine like a centipede. I turned back and resumed walking. Now hyper-aware of every sound, for several seconds I heard only my own footsteps, and I began to relax, attributing the phantom sounds to stress-induced auditory hallucination. Sleep deprivation could do strange things to perception. Then they started again, footsteps behind me. Perfectly synchronized with my own, but fractionally deeper in tone. When I slowed, they slowed in exact measure. When I quickened my pace, so did they. The distance between us seemed unchanged, close enough to hear clearly, too far to feel the presence of another person. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead. Despite the chill in the air, my mouth went desert dry as I spun around again more quickly this time. Again, nothing. The empty plaza mocked me with its stillness. No hiding places existed in the immediate vicinity. The nearest bench was 30 feet away, the closest planter even farther. I forced myself to breathe deeply, fighting the tightness in my chest. I was a rational person. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps some quirk of architecture was creating an acoustic anomaly, bouncing my own footsteps back at me with altered sound properties. Or maybe my sleep-deprived brain was filling in auditory patterns that weren't actually there. Deciding to test my theory, I deliberately changed my walking pattern, taking 3 quick steps, followed by a pause, then 2 slow steps. The following footsteps matched perfectly, 3 quick pause, 2 slow. Exactly as I had walked, but with that distinctive heavier quality, like someone slightly larger than myself. My heart pounded against my ribs now, each beat sending a rush of blood that I could hear wooing in my ears. The taste of copper filled my mouth as I bit the inside of my cheek without realizing it. Every instinct screamed to run, but some primitive part of me warned that running would be worse, that whatever followed would chase. If I fled instead, I walked toward the center of the plaza where the defunct fountain stood dry and silent. The open space around it would eliminate any possibility of someone hiding nearby. As I approached the circular stone structure, the footsteps continued their perfect mimicry of my own. Maintaining that same distance at the fountain's edge, I sat down, suddenly aware of how badly my legs were trembling. The footsteps stopped when I did the final one, seeming to land just a few feet behind me. The silence that followed was absolute and somehow worse than the phantom sounds had been. I sent a text to my roommate Miles, asking if he was awake. No response came, which wasn't surprising at this hour. Still, the act of reaching out to another human being provided momentary comfort. I considered calling someone, anyone, just to hear a voice, but pride stopped me. What would I say that I was being followed by invisible footsteps after 5 minutes of sitting motionless? My breathing had steadied and I began to feel foolish. Stress and exhaustion were clearly taking a heavier toll than I'd realized, deciding to return home and finally get some sleep. I stood up and took a step away from the fountain. The footstep behind me came immediately, just one, and then stopped when I did my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Whatever acoustic phenomenon might explain, echoing footsteps could not account for this single responsive step. It had the deliberate quality of something waiting, something attentive to my movements. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as a certainty settled over me. I was not alone in this empty plaza. I know someone's there, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. This isn't funny. Nothing answered but the distant drone of a plane passing high overhead. I took my phone out again and switched on the flashlight, sweeping its beam in a wide arc behind me. The stark white light caught nothing but empty concrete and the angular shadows of art installations. I panned it slowly across the entire area, finding no place where anyone could conceivably hide with trembling fingers. I opened my camera app and took several photos in different directions, scrutinizing each one for any sign of another presence. Nothing appeared in the images except the deserted plaza. That's when I noticed how cold it had become. My breath now fogged in front of my face. Despite it being a mild September night, the temperature seemed to be dropping by the second, and a new sensation joined my fear. The distinct feeling of being watched, not just followed, but observed with intense focused attention. I decided to walk the perimeter of the plaza, staying in the best-lit areas. If I circled back to the east entrance, I'd be just 3 blocks from home. As I moved, the footsteps resumed their perfect synchronization with mine. My shoulders hunched involuntarily, as though trying to withdraw from the invisible presence at my back. Halfway around the plaza's edge, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The LED lights, which normally shone with consistent brightness, were dimming wherever I approached, then returning to full strength after I passed, like something was drawing power from them, or like something was moving between me and each light source as I walked. I tried to dismiss this as imagination, but when I deliberately backed up watching a light, I just passed it dimmed again as I approached my rational mind. Scrambled for explanations, power fluctuations, faulty circuitry. but found nothing convincing. The footsteps behind me had stopped when I did, but now I detected something new, a subtle shift in air pressure as though something substantial had moved closer. The space directly behind me felt heavier, somehow charged with presence. My breathing became shallow and rapid. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as I fought against incipient panic. I managed to whisper a question to the empty air. "What do you want?" The response came not in words, but in sensation. A sudden icy touch between my shoulder blades so cold it burned through my jacket. I jerked forward with a strangled cry, spinning around with my arms raised defensively. The plaza remained empty, but the air where I had been standing seemed to shimmer slightly like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Except this was cold, so cold it made my eyes water to look directly at it. Logic and reason abandoned me. I ran my feet, pounded the concrete as I sprinted toward the exit, no longer caring if running would provoke whatever followed behind me. The footsteps gave chase, no longer matching my pace, but gaining faster, heavier, more numerous. What had sounded like a single follower now sounded like many a crowd of pursuing steps that echoed from all directions. The exit seemed impossibly distant, the path stretching before me like in a nightmare. My lungs burned and my legs felt weighted as terror overwhelmed my system with adrenaline and cortisol. The lights along my escape route dimmed one by one as I approached them. Leaving me running through patches of darkness, something brushed against my back again. Not a touch this time, but a presence like someone had leaned in close enough that I could feel their breath on my neck, except there was no warmth to this breath. Only a penetrating bone-deep chill that seemed to reach inside me. I heard myself making sounds I never had before. Not quite screams, but desperate animal noises of fear. My foot caught on an uneven seam in the concrete, and I stumbled, nearly falling headlong as I regained my balance. I felt something solid move directly in front of me, blocking my path, though I could see nothing there. Instinctively, I dodged to the side. The sensation of a solid mass passing close to my face was unmistakable, like ducking under an invisible arm. The footsteps were all around me now, no longer following but circling. Hurting the exit was 30 feet away, I made a final desperate sprint, lungs heaving, muscles screaming as I crossed the threshold from plaza to sidewalk. The cacophony of footsteps suddenly ceased the pressure in the air, dissipated, and the streetlights shone with normal, steady brightness. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment building, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the entrance door inside my apartment. I collapsed on the couch, unable to catch my breath or slow my thundering heart. Miles's bedroom door remained closed. He had slept through. My return sleep was impossible that night. I sat with all the lights on, jumping at every normal settling noise the building made when dawn finally came. I convinced myself that exhaustion had caused me to hallucinate the entire experience the human mind under. Sufficient stress could produce remarkably convincing false perceptions. I avoided the plaza in the following days, taking longer routes to work and home. A week passed and the memory began to lose its sharp edge of terror, becoming something I could almost laugh about, an embarrassing stress reaction. Nothing more. Then yesterday, Miles mentioned something that froze the blood in my veins. He asked if I'd been pacing the apartment at night when I told him I hadn't. He described being woken at exactly 2 a.m. by footsteps in our living room, footsteps that stopped whenever he called out, only to resume minutes later, footsteps that continued long into the night, circling through our apartment, pausing occasionally outside his bedroom door. Footsteps that, according to him, sounded nothing like mine. Heavier, more deliberate footsteps that he only began hearing the night after I walked through Oakwood Plaza tonight. It's 1:55 a.m. I'm sitting in the dark of my bedroom listening in 5 minutes. I know the footsteps will start again, and I understand now what I brought home with me that night. What followed me, not just through the plaza, but all the way to my door, I realize now it never wanted to harm me, it wanted to follow me home.